They called it the Island of Death, a place where ships sank by the dozens and men vanished into the jungle, yet it became the first step toward victory in the Pacific. In August 1942, US Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, marking the Allies' first major offensive against Japan. What followed was not a single battle, but a 6-month campaign of relentless attrition, fought on jungle trails in treacherous seas and across dark skies filled with the thunder of warplanes. Here naval armadas clashed in the night, destroyers and cruisers firing at point-blank range, while carriers launched desperate strikes in chaotic waters that came to be called Ironbottom Sound. On the island itself, soldiers faced not only each other, but hunger, malaria, and exhaustion, as supply lines broke down and reinforcements bled into the fight. For Japan, Guadalcanal was a chance to hold the initiative. For America, it was a desperate gamble to halt an empire that had seemed unstoppable. It was a campaign of shock, sacrifice, and endurance, where victory was measured not in swift gains, but in survival from one brutal month to the next. By the end, Guadalcanal was more than an island. It became the graveyard of Japan's expansion, the place where the tide of war finally began to turn. And as we dive into this story together, I want you to settle in, whether you're watching from your couch late at night, lying in bed winding down, or listening on your commute. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the global community of history lovers coming together here. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to explore more untold chapters of World War II in this same immersive style. This is the entire Battle of Guadalcanal, a turning point in the Pacific War. Let's begin. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, it unleashed a year-long offensive that remade the map of the Pacific in a few bloody months. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Singapore's humiliating fall to the rapid conquest of the Dutch East Indies, Tokyo's armies and fleets advanced with a combination of carrier aviation, amphibious doctrine, and shock that stunned Allied planners. By early 1942, Japanese forces controlled vital sea lanes, seized the oil and rubber resources the empire desperately needed, and established forward bases that pushed the front line ever closer to Australia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carrier-centered thinking and the Army's appetite for bold landings created an operational tempo that left defenders reacting rather than shaping events. For the Allies, the collapse of British Singapore in February 1942 and the fall of the Philippines in May erased any illusion that the Pacific could be defended by pre-war dispositions alone. Across the South Pacific, the Imperial Navy and Army planted garrisons on islands, airfields, and seaplane anchorages, converting coral atolls and volcanic ridges into forward operating bases. These bases were not mere symbols, they were nodes in a logistical web that extended Japanese reach for reconnaissance, air cover, and nighttime destroyer resupply, the Tokyo Express that would soon define the Solomon fights. American and Commonwealth commanders watched as each new foothold shortened the corridor of safety between the United States and Australia, a supply lifeline measured in days of steaming and vulnerability. The speed of the Japanese advance forced a rethink in Washington, Canberra, and London: fight forward where possible, deny Tokyo the ability to threaten sea lanes, and find points where thin Allied resources could have decisive effect. That strategic calculus, how to transition from desperate defense to a controlled offensive, became the crucible in which Guadalcanal's importance was forged. At the heart of the problem lay geography. Shipping routes from the United States to Australia threaded through the South Pacific, passing by Fiji, New Caledonia, and the New Hebrides on corridors that supplied General MacArthur's forces and kept Australia in the fight. Control of those sea lanes was measured not just by tonnage, but by time. How long convoys took to transit, and how exposed they were to aerial reconnaissance, submarines, and surface raiders. A Japanese air or seaplane base on the eastern approaches to the Solomon Islands could observe and interdict movements from Noumea to Espiritu Santo and from there to northern Australia, instantly raising the cost of every voyage. Tulagi, a small cluster of islets in the Florida Islands just north of Guadalcanal, offered a sheltered anchorage perfect for seaplanes to alight, refuel, and spot targets across hundreds of miles of ocean. Those seaplanes, long-range floatplanes and reconnaissance types operated by the Imperial Navy, were the eyes of the fleet, capable of scouting convoys and vectoring in torpedo planes or surface forces. If Tokyo perfected a chain of seaplane bases and airstrips across the Solomons, Allied supply lines would be placed under constant surveillance and in peril of interdiction. Allied logisticians understood that a single airfield within reach of those lanes could force convoys to take longer, more dangerous routes or risk annihilation en route. The Solomons were a funnel. Seize its throat and you could throttle the flow of Allied power into the Southwest Pacific. That simple geographic truth turned isolated coral atolls into stakes worth men's lives and drew intense attention from planners in Pearl Harbor, Melbourne, and London. The Japanese were quick to exploit such geography, and in the spring of 1942, they established seaplane operations and observation networks on Tulagi that immediately alarmed Allied coast watchers and intelligence officers. From Tulagi, floatplanes could shadow convoys for hours, dropping weather reports and relaying precise bearings so surface forces and bombers could be vectored to intercept. Tulagi's mooring fields, radio relays and fuel dumps became an extension of Rabaul's reconnaissance reach, knitting the Solomons into Tokyo's broader defensive ring. On those narrow islets, sailors and engineers labored in punishing tropical heat to construct moorings, fuel caches, and shallow maintenance facilities, while living under the constant haze of insect-borne disease. The men who worked there endured cramped tenders, muddy landings, and the ever-present risk of surprise attack. Daily life on Tulagi was a study in endurance as much as aggression. Allied pilots and patrol craft tried to deny those eyes the freedom to operate, but long distances and limited Allied air resources meant the Japanese often operated with impunity during daylight. Intelligence gathered by coast watchers, native scouts, and intercepted communications painted a worrying picture. The Japanese reconnaissance umbrella from Tulagi already extended into critical convoy routes. The menace was therefore both tactical and psychological. When merchant mariners knew they were being watched across half the ocean, routing choices and timing became dangerous gambles. Denying Tulagi was not a nicety. It was a strategic necessity if Allied convoys were to survive the long voyage south and west. Australian leaders in Canberra watched the island chessboard with growing alarm, because the Solomons touched directly on their northern approaches and the survival of the continent's war effort. Ports such as Townsville and Brisbane were the arteries through which men, fuel, and ammunition flowed into New Guinea, and any interdiction would threaten operations there and the defence of Australia itself. Japanese control of Guadalcanal or adjacent islets would also give Tokyo a forward base for submarines and night raiders to prey on coastal shipping, turning routine convoy runs into dangerous missions under threat of ambush. Crucially, an airstrip on Guadalcanal would put land-based aircraft within reach of the Coral Sea approaches, enabling the enemy to contest airspace that Allied pilots had previously used with relative safety. In the wake of Singapore and the Philippines, Australian planners pressed Washington and London for action that would stop the steady extension of Japanese forward bases. For MacArthur's forces in New Guinea, those requests were existential. Without secure sea lanes, supply dwindled and positions became untenable. Politically too, failure carried weight. An isolated Australia would be vulnerable to political panic and a breakdown in the Allied southern front. Canberra therefore added a diplomatic drumbeat to the military logic. The Solomons were not peripheral, they were linchpins for the entire Southwest Pacific strategy. The Australian voice, insistent and urgent, helped shape the Allied consensus that something decisive had to be done. In Washington, the question became one of priorities. Where could limited Allied resources be applied to greatest effect without fatally endangering other theaters? Admiral Ernest King, wearing the dual hats of Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, argued urgently for action to seize the initiative. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded Allied naval and amphibious forces in the Pacific from Pearl Harbor, balanced King's aggressiveness with hard calculations about the shipping, carriers, and amphibious lift available for contested landings. General Douglas MacArthur and his staff emphasized the downstream benefits. A forward base in the Solomons would strengthen the entire New Guinea campaign. British and Australian ministers pushed for operations that would protect southern approaches, sometimes offering Commonwealth troops or facilities to share the burden. Out of that pressure cooker, one option began to stand out: a combined amphibious seizure of Guadalcanal, coupled with occupation of Tulagi to deny the Japanese seaplane anchorage. Planners reasoned that Japanese construction at Lunga Point was still incomplete, and that a rapid, well-executed landing might seize a potential airfield before Tokyo could reinforce it. The proposition was ugly with risk: landings across coral reefs into dense jungle, tenuous naval cover, and the reality of tropical disease, but its strategic upside could be decisive. For senior commanders, the calculation narrowed: act boldly now to deny the enemy a base, or accept the slow grinding attrition of Allied mobility and reach. That choice was informed by a fragile mosaic of intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance photos, intercepted Japanese transmissions, and the reports of coast watchers who operated in the Solomons' remote atolls. Australian and Allied coast watchers, often isolated observers living for months in jungle outposts, sent back urgent dispatches describing men ashore, moorings, and the first scars of earthworks at Lunga Point. Aerial photo interpreters examined the glint of machinery and the telltale lines of freshly moved coral, and judged that the Japanese were indeed building something of operational consequence. Naval intelligence analysts stitched those clues together and issued warnings that once operational, air operations from Guadalcanal would reach critical convoy routes within hours of detection. Crucially, those same reports suggested a narrow window. Enemy facilities were nascent, garrison strength limited, and surprise still attainable if the Allies moved swiftly. That intelligence, however, arrived with caveats. Details were incomplete, radio intercepts ambiguous, and Coast Watcher reports sometimes contradictory, so planners had to weigh risk, not certainty. The window's fragility intensified the urgency. Delay would allow Japan to harden defenses that a hurried assault might otherwise exploit. So the choice became tactical as well as strategic: seize the moment or surrender it, and face a far harder battle later. Executing such a seizure demanded amphibious skill the Allies were only beginning to master, and logistics would be the campaign's quiet determinator. Planners had to assemble transports, landing craft, and escort vessels, while juggling scarce carrier and cruiser availabilities across a broad theater. At the center of the assault would be veteran Marine units trained to move across coral, surge beyond surf, and fight through tangled jungle, where visibility vanished and ambush was constant. Engineers and Seabees were rehearsed and briefed to convert any cleared ground at Lunga Point into an operational fighter strip within days, for the campaign's survival hinged on bringing up aircraft quickly. Naval task forces scraped together the escort carriers and patrol bombers that might provide protective air cover, while medical officers prepared evacuation procedures for tropical wounds and infectious disease that had long been the hidden killer of island campaigns. Every crate of fuel, barrel of water and pallet of ammunition counted. A single shortfall in the first frantic days ashore could force an operation to fail despite courage and determination. Men rehearsed jungle patrols and beach exits in humidity and sweat, preparing for a type of warfare where terrain, mosquitoes, and heat could be as deadly as Japanese rifle fire. In short, the assault would be as much an exercise in logistics and endurance as in tactics and firepower. All these threads, geography, intelligence, logistics, and political urgency, came together in a bold plan codenamed Operation WATCHTOWER, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. Under that plan, amphibious forces would land simultaneously on Tulagi, Gavutu, and the northern beaches of Guadalcanal, seizing the seaplane anchorage and the incomplete strip at Lunga Point before Tokyo could finish and fortify them. Commanders accepted naked risk. Landing forces could be isolated. Carrier screens might be forced off station by superior Japanese forces, and holding jungle ground required supply lines exposed to enemy interdiction. Yet the alternative, allowing the Japanese air umbrella to mature and make Allied convoys vulnerable, was judged a far worse fate for the Southwest Pacific strategy. Admirals and generals agreed to gamble that surprise and speed would offset numerical shortages, and that a foothold could be turned into an airbase able to contest the sea lanes. Admiral Nimitz signed the order, delegating tactical command to the task forces and to the Marines who would make the first landings. For the troops who loaded into Higgins' boats, and for the sailors standing watch on escort bridges, Guadalcanal ceased to be abstract strategy and became a place of hot sand, coral, and jungle, a place where courage, supply, and command would be tested in equal measure. By dawn on August 7, 1942, the gamble began. Guadalcanal was chosen, and the Pacific would never look the same. Guadalcanal was not the largest island in the Pacific, nor the most developed, but its geography gave it a power out of all proportion to its size. Stretching 90 miles in length with a mountainous spine rising over 7,000 feet, it offered ridgelines, jungles, and valleys that could swallow armies whole. To the north lay Ironbottom Sound, a narrow passage of sea that funneled warships and convoys into predictable paths, perfect for ambush and control. To the east stretched the Slot, a long corridor of water threading the Solomon Islands, soon to be the nightly highway of Japanese destroyers. To the south, shipping routes from the United States to Australia passed within striking range of long-range bombers based on its coasts. The interior was dense with rainforests and rivers, where rain turned trails into quagmires and movement slowed to a crawl. But at Lunga Point, geography provided a rare open plain where a coral strip could be carved out, hard enough to support aircraft. That single open patch of earth transformed Guadalcanal from a forgotten jungle island into the most valuable piece of real estate in the Pacific. Whoever held it controlled not just the Solomon Islands, but the arteries of supply that kept entire nations alive. And that reality gave Guadalcanal strategic importance far beyond its shores. The Japanese understood this before most allies did, beginning work in mid-1942 to construct an airfield at Lunga Point. Naval engineers and forced laborers hacked coral, cut palms, and flattened ground under a blazing sun, laying out a strip intended for medium bombers and fighters. Their goal was clear: extend reconnaissance reach, provide air cover for convoys, and deny Allied ships free passage through southern waters. If operational, the airfield could project Japanese power 600 miles to the south, reaching deep into shipping lanes that supplied MacArthur's forces in New Guinea and sustained Australia's survival. For Tokyo, this was part of a larger outer defensive ring, a chain of bases stretching from Rabaul to the Gilberts designed to lock the Allies out of the Western Pacific. The airfield was not a minor construction project, but a cornerstone of imperial strategy. Pilots flying from it could interdict convoys bound for Espiritu Santo, Nouméa and Port Moresby, turning Allied logistics into a nightmare of attrition. Every gallon of aviation fuel poured onto the strip, every length of pierced steel planking, was an investment in regional dominance. The Japanese wagered that a single functioning airfield could shift the balance of power, and for months they worked in sweltering secrecy, confident the Allies would not strike in time. To American planners studying aerial reconnaissance in June 1942, the sight of bulldozers clearing coral at Lunga Point was nothing less than a red warning flare. Admiral Nimitz's staff, poring over photographs, recognized the telltale geometry of a bomber runway emerging from the jungle. Coast watchers hidden on nearby islands sent urgent radio reports describing machinery noise, construction traffic, and Japanese patrols expanding security perimeters. These reports carried the same refrain: the window was closing fast, and once operational, the strip would dominate the approaches to the Coral Sea. Logistics officers warned that convoys carrying everything from fuel drums to B-17 spare parts would have to pass within bombing range of the new base. In Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, the tone of reports shifted from concern to alarm. If the airfield stood, Australia itself might be isolated. Analysts noted how Tulagi, just across the channel, could serve as a seaplane base to supplement Lunga, creating a combined system of surveillance and strike. Together, Tulagi and Guadalcanal formed a pincer that could close the South Pacific corridor. The Allies did not have the luxury of time or options, and thus Guadalcanal became not a curiosity, but a critical target. The location of Guadalcanal also offered a springboard for whoever held it, opening offensive possibilities in every direction. From Henderson Field, what the captured strip would soon be named, Allied fighters and dive bombers could strike north toward Japanese convoys supplying New Guinea. To the west, bombers could harass shipping moving between Rabaul and Bougainville, cutting arteries feeding Tokyo's most important stronghold in the South Pacific. To the south, aircraft could cover Allied convoys steaming between Espiritu Santo and Australia, creating a protective umbrella that shortened supply lines. And to the east, reconnaissance flights could patrol the endless expanse of the Pacific, reducing the surprise advantage that Japanese naval forces had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor. In short, possession of Guadalcanal flipped the map, transforming a defensive nightmare into an offensive asset. A single coral runway became the hinge on which an entire oceanic strategy turned. The side that controlled it dictated the tempo of operations across thousands of miles of water, and that truth made Guadalcanal the most contested strip of Earth in 1942. Tulagi, though smaller and less dramatic, played an equally vital supporting role in this geography of war. The islets offered sheltered anchorages perfect for seaplanes, enabling reconnaissance across vast distances without the need for land-based airstrips. Japanese Kawanishi, flying boats and float planes, could alight, refuel, and take off again, extending their scouting range like tireless eyes of the fleet. For convoys, Tulagi's seaplanes were a lethal threat, spotting ships hundreds of miles away, and guiding in long-range torpedo bombers. When paired with the airfield at Lunga, Tulagi created a layered surveillance network that could shadow and strike Allied movements with relentless pressure. For Allied mariners steaming south, it meant living under constant risk, their positions known before they even sighted enemy aircraft. Denying Tulagi was therefore as important as seizing Guadalcanal itself, for together they represented the jaws of a trap across the supply lines. Allied planners concluded that leaving the islets in Japanese hands would mean fighting the Pacific War with blindfolds on. In the Solomons, seaplane moorings mattered as much as coral runways, and so the name Tulagi entered Allied war plans with equal urgency. Both sides understood that the struggle over Guadalcanal would not be measured by square miles but by air miles, how far planes could fly, how quickly reinforcements could be moved, and how tightly convoys could be strangled. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal promised to shield Rabaul, their fortress base, from Allied encirclement, while offering a forward bastion to isolate Australia. For the Allies, seizing it promised to halt Tokyo's expansion and create a stepping stone toward eventual offensives across the Central Pacific. The clash was not merely over ground but over the ability to command skies and seas across an ocean half a world wide. This realization drove the disproportionate commitment of battleships, carriers and divisions to what appeared at first glance to be a forgotten jungle island. Guadalcanal was in truth a fulcrum, a point where the balance of Pacific war could be tipped one way or the other. That balance would be measured in convoys sunk, carriers lost, and lives consumed in the fight for control of a single strip of earth. And in 1942, both sides believed the risk was worth the sacrifice. On the ground, the terrain itself shaped how the airfield would determine the campaign's tempo. Henderson Field sat on coral plains just inland from Lunga Point, flanked by ridges and river lines that gave defenders natural high ground. Jungle growth pressed close, forcing clearings to be carved and patrolled constantly, lest infiltrators creep within mortar range. The nearby Matanikau River and ridges to the south provided both cover for Japanese assaults and obstacles that complicated Allied defense. The field's runways, built of crushed coral, could withstand tropical rains that turned dirt tracks into mud rivers, making it a rare and invaluable asset in such a climate. To hold Henderson meant constant engineering work, fuel delivery, and patrols to secure its perimeter against probing attacks. For Marines on the island, the airfield became not just a base but the heart of their survival, its aircraft providing cover, its location drawing every Japanese counterstroke. Geography dictated tactics, and tactics dictated survival. On Guadalcanal, terrain and technology fused in the crucible of war, and every ridge, river, and runway became part of the battle for air supremacy. By July 1942, as Japanese bulldozers droned and Allied planners finalized Operation WATCHTOWER, the fate of the Pacific began to pivot. A battle was brewing that would consume ships, planes, and lives at a scale neither side fully anticipated. Guadalcanal was not chosen because it was glamorous or rich, but because it was necessary, a crossroads where geography and strategy collided. The Allies knew they were gambling with thin resources, but the cost of inaction was too great to bear. Japanese commanders believed they could hold with determination and reinforcements, but they underestimated the Allied resolve once committed. Both sides saw in the airfield at Lunga Point a symbol of future dominance. Control it and the Pacific would be yours to shape. The strip was barely complete. Its coral still raw, its perimeter thinly held, but its strategic value was already immense. The decision to strike at Guadalcanal was therefore not just a tactical choice but a strategic turning point. The Pacific had been dominated by Japanese advances since 1941. Now on a jungle island few had heard of, the momentum would be contested. In the summer of 1942, inside the war rooms of Pearl Harbor, Washington, and Melbourne, a bold decision took shape under the code name Operation WATCHTOWER. It would be the first major American amphibious offensive of the Pacific War, conceived less than 8 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overseeing the Pacific Ocean areas, balanced urgency with cold arithmetic, weighing thin resources against immense strategic stakes. His staff studied maps of the Solomons, their fingers tracing convoy routes, noting distances, and calculating how far carriers could remain on station before fuel forced withdrawal. Intelligence was sparse, often relying on blurry aerial photos and cryptic coastwatcher reports describing Japanese movements on Guadalcanal. Washington pressed for action, eager to seize the initiative after the victories at Coral Sea and Midway, but reluctant to commit too much too soon. In these rooms, politics intertwined with strategy, as inter-service rivalries complicated decisions about who would lead and who would supply. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding in the Southwest Pacific, lobbied hard for resources, arguing Guadalcanal was vital to New Guinea's survival. The Navy countered that only it could deliver, supply and sustain such an audacious landing. Out of these disputes emerged WATCHTOWER, a plan bold in concept but fragile in execution. The politics of Allied cooperation shaped every discussion, for Australia and New Zealand demanded protection, while Britain offered advice but little material help. MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane pushed for priority, believing the Solomons fell under his theatre, yet Admiral King in Washington insisted it remain a Navy-led endeavour. King, never one to yield ground to the Army, framed Guadalcanal as the Navy's moment to prove it could project power ashore. The Joint Chiefs debated timetables, with King pressing for speed before Japanese defences hardened and General Marshall worrying about stretching logistics too thin. Roosevelt himself approved the operation, his confidence in naval aviation boosted by Midway's carrier triumph. Yet behind the bold announcements lay shortages, not enough transports, limited landing craft, and carriers already worn thin by months of relentless operations. British observers, watching from afar, doubted such a hasty offensive could succeed, recalling their own disasters in Malaya and Singapore. Australians, however, urged speed, knowing Japanese planes from Guadalcanal would threaten their lifeline. In the end, urgency triumphed over caution. The plan would move forward with what was available, not what was ideal. The composition of the task force reflected both ambition and improvisation. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the carriers, his ships providing the only meaningful air cover for landings in hostile waters. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner directed the amphibious assault force, his transports carrying the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander Vandegrift. The Marines, numbering just over 19,000, were chosen because they were trained in amphibious doctrine, though few had combat experience. Turner's transports included everything from fleet carriers to hastily converted freighters, their holds packed with rations, ammunition, bulldozers and tents. Destroyers and cruisers formed protective screens, but many were older classes, veterans of pre-war deployments ill-suited for the ferocious night battles to come. The fleet carried just enough supplies for a short campaign, not a drawn-out fight, reflecting the gamble of planners who believed swift victory possible. Air cover would last only as long as the carriers could remain within range, and Fletcher warned he could not linger once Japanese pressure intensified. That fragility meant once the Marines were ashore, their fate would hinge on seizing the airfield quickly. Every ship, every man, every gallon of fuel in the task force was stretched thin. And yet the Armada represented the first Allied bid to wrest initiative from Tokyo. Inside planning rooms, the logistical calculus became as decisive as any battle map. The Solomons lay nearly 1,200 miles from the nearest major Allied base at Espiritu Santo, a distance that strained supply convoys and escorts. Fuel alone became an obsession. Oilers had to be staged, routes protected, and calculations made to the last barrel. Landing craft were scarce, forcing Marines to practice rapid unloading so ships could withdraw before being caught in daylight air raids. Ammunition had to be rationed from the outset, with planners warning Vandegrift that resupply might be uncertain. Medical staff prepared to treat tropical diseases as well as wounds, knowing malaria could claim more men than bullets. Engineers packed heavy equipment to carve Henderson Field out of coral, but weight restrictions forced painful trade-offs. Fewer tanks, more bulldozers, less artillery than doctrine prescribed. Supply officers fretted that one or two lost transports could cripple the entire operation's sustainment. Even the weather, torrential rains and oppressive humidity, was factored into tables that estimated how quickly men would weaken under jungle conditions. In these calculations, logistics was not background detail, but the skeleton upon which the operation's survival rested. And everyone knew the skeleton was fragile. The intelligence picture was equally uncertain. A mosaic of fragments and guesswork. Photographs showed bulldozed clearings on Guadalcanal, but analysts debated whether it was a supply depot or an airstrip in progress. Coast watchers radioed reports of Japanese activity, yet their numbers varied wildly, suggesting anywhere from hundreds to thousands of enemy troops. Radio intercepts hinted at reinforcements moving south from Rabaul, but the timing was unclear, leaving planners unsure how much opposition to expect. The Navy worried about Japanese carriers, still lurking in the Central Pacific, and capable of striking the invasion fleet without warning. Marines trained for worst-case scenarios, yet commanders quietly hoped the garrisons would be light and disorganized. In reality, the Japanese presence was smaller than feared, but planners could not risk underestimating an enemy that had swept all before them since December 1941. The lack of certainty infused the operation with tension. Commanders would commit thousands of men into an intelligence fog. Watchtower was, in essence, a leap in the dark, guided by fragmentary clues and bold assumptions. And in that darkness, fortune would decide as much as planning. The personalities driving the plan shaped its tone as much as strategy. Admiral King, brusque and relentless, demanded action to prove the Navy's offensive spirit and to demonstrate to allies that America could lead. Nimitz, calm and pragmatic, approved the plan while warning his subordinates to prepare for setbacks that might stretch into months. Fletcher, cautious after losses at Coral Sea and Midway, fretted about preserving his carriers, unwilling to risk them beyond a few critical days. Turner, exacting and hard-nosed, pushed Marines through rigorous rehearsals, determined that his transports would not linger a moment longer than necessary. Vandegrift, stoic and thoughtful, faced the impossible task of leading untested Marines into jungle combat, with limited supplies and little promise of reinforcement. Each man brought his own temperament to Watchtower, and their interactions often bristled with tension. Yet together they embodied the Navy-Marine team that would define Pacific warfare. Their differences mirrored the risks inherent in the plan itself, cautious, bold, pragmatic, and desperate all at once. And in those personalities lay the seeds of both friction and resilience. The Marines themselves, many barely out of training, absorbed the plan's audacity with a mixture of fear and determination. They drilled on beaches in Samoa and New Zealand, practicing how to disembark Higgins boats into surf that would churn with gunfire. Young men packed rifles, grenades and letters from home into packs already heavy with tropical gear. Few had seen combat, but all knew the Japanese reputation for ferocity and suicidal attack, stories passed from Bataan and Wake Island. Their equipment was basic Springfield rifles, light mortars, and a handful of 37mm anti-tank guns, hardly impressive against an enemy seasoned by a year of victory. Yet morale was lifted by the sense that they were no longer retreating, but striking back, taking the war to an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Officers emphasized speed, seize the airfield, dig in and hold until supplies could catch up. For the Marines, Henderson Field was not just an objective, but their lifeline, the difference between survival and annihilation. The men did not yet know how many months of hardship awaited them, but in their minds the operation marked the turning of the tide. By late July 1942, WATCHTOWER was set in motion, the armada assembling at Fiji for final rehearsals before striking north. Ships crowded harbours with supplies piled to decks, aircraft lashed to catapults, and men drilling endlessly in tropical heat. Commanders pored over maps, revising timetables and routes, knowing that a single miscalculation could doom the entire force. Even as they trained, Japanese engineers on Guadalcanal laboured under the same sun, extending their runway toward operational readiness. It was now a race, measured not in days but in hours. Who would finish first, the bulldozers or the landing craft? The Allies gambled that surprise would give them a narrow margin to seize the unfinished strip. Yet everyone understood that once ashore they would be committed beyond recall, dependent on fragile convoys and overstretched carriers. The operation's name, WATCHTOWER, was apt, for from Guadalcanal the Allies hoped to watch over the Pacific and turn defense into offense. What began as hurried planning in Washington had become a rolling juggernaut of men and steel, and as August approached, the Pacific held its breath for the clash to come. At dawn on August 7th, 1942, the South Pacific lay cloaked in mist as the largest American amphibious force yet assembled approached the Solomon Islands. The sea was churning with the wakes of transports, destroyers, and carriers, each holding men who knew they were about to make history. At 0613, naval guns thundered, hurling shells at Tulagi, Gavutu, and Guadalcanal, their concussions echoing off jungle-clad ridges. Aircraft roared overhead, dive bombers peeling from cloud cover to hammer Japanese positions with bombs and strafing runs. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and sweat as Marines crowded the decks of transports, adjusting their gear and glancing nervously at the horizon. Many were seasick after days in cramped holds, yet adrenaline steadied their hands as ramps clattered down. In Higgins' boats they splashed into choppy surf, rifles clutched tightly, water lapping at their knees as they pushed toward unseen beaches. Officers barked orders above the roar of engines and gunfire, trying to impose order on chaos. Each man felt the weight of the unknown, what waited beyond the tree line, and how many would make it back. The long-anticipated WATCHTOWER operation had now become reality. The landings on Guadalcanal's Lunga point met with less resistance than expected, though confusion and chaos still ruled the beaches. Japanese laborers and a small detachment of guards melted into the jungle, rather than face overwhelming naval and aerial firepower. Marines stormed ashore, bayonets fixed, expecting a hail of bullets but encountering instead scattered rifle fire and abandoned earthworks. Bulldozers and engineers moved in behind them, pushing debris aside to secure the airfield construction site. The jungle pressed close, thick with vines, insects, and the heavy smell of rot, an alien environment that immediately tested stamina and discipline. Men hacked through undergrowth, sweat pouring into their eyes, rifles slung as they carried crates of ammunition and food. Supplies piled chaotically on the sand as landing craft churned back and forth, vulnerable to any sudden air attack. Discipline frayed in the sweltering heat, but officers forced order with curt commands, knowing survival depended on efficiency. Marines dug shallow foxholes, nervously watching the tree line, half expecting Japanese counterattacks to erupt at any moment. The real struggle, they realized, was not just against an enemy, but against an unforgiving environment. On Guadalcanal, the jungle was as much an opponent as the soldiers who defended it. Across the channel at Tulagi, The situation was far different, for here the Japanese defenders chose to fight to the death. The island was small, barely 3 miles long, but honeycombed with caves, dugouts, and fortified bunkers manned by 350 Japanese sailors and troops. Naval bombardment had churned its beaches into smoking craters, but many defenders simply sheltered underground, waiting for the shelling to cease. When Marines stormed ashore, machine guns opened from hidden positions, cutting down men in the surf. Smoke, screams, and the crash of grenades filled the air as small squads fanned out to clear bunkers one by one. Close quarters combat ruled the day, rifles fired at point-blank range, bayonets thrust into dugouts, satchel charges hurled into caves. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical resolve, refusing surrender even when surrounded and outnumbered. The Marines advanced yard by yard, trading lives for ground in a brutal initiation to Pacific Island warfare. Blood mingled with seawater on the beaches, a foretaste of the long campaign ahead. Tulagi was secured only through relentless determination and courage under fire. Gavutu, a tiny islet only 500 yards across, proved an even more deadly puzzle. Japanese defenders occupied fortified positions in caves carved into a central hill that dominated the island. The terrain offered little cover, forcing Marines to dash across exposed causeways and open ground under machine gun fire. Landing craft drifted toward shore under a storm of bullets, men leaping into waist-deep water and pushing forward with grenades clenched in their teeth. Engineers brought flamethrowers, using jets of fire to clear bunkers that could not be taken by rifle or bayonet. Every cave became a fortress, every dugout a killing ground, where grenades and smoke filled the air in choking waves. Casualties mounted rapidly, with entire squads cut down in minutes, as they tried to storm narrow entrances. Medical corpsmen worked furiously under fire, dragging wounded men to makeshift dressing stations amid rubble. Fighting on Gavutu raged into the night, the island's defenders exacting a brutal toll before being wiped out. By dusk, Marines had learned a lesson that would repeat throughout the Pacific. On small islands, every yard would be contested. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines pushed inland toward the airfield at Lunga Point. Astonished by the scale of Japanese construction, graders, bulldozers, and earth movers lay abandoned, some still half buried in coral dust, evidence of a project suddenly abandoned under fire. The strip was already several thousand feet long, a skeleton of what would soon become Henderson Field, the fulcrum of the entire campaign. Engineers and Seabees immediately began clearing wreckage, their priority to finish the runway before Japanese reinforcements arrived. Marines patrolled the perimeter, nervous at every rustle of foliage, but organized resistance was nowhere to be found. Yet the quiet was unsettling, for veterans sensed that the enemy had not fled but melted into the jungle. Supplies piled higher on the beaches, crates of ammunition and food stacked with little protection against air or artillery attack. Officers urged haste, warning that the Japanese would not allow the loss of Guadalcanal to go unanswered. Already, messages flashed across Allied radios, reporting enemy naval movements from Rabaul. Guadalcanal was secured for now, but no one believed it would stay quiet for long. The calm was merely the pause before the storm. Individual acts of heroism marked the landings, small moments that revealed the grit of ordinary men. At Tulagi, Sergeant John Basilone's future comrades carried out desperate grenade exchanges, with defenders refusing to yield even when wounded. At Gavutu, engineers risked their lives to carry flamethrowers forward, knowing they would draw every bullet while clearing caves. On Guadalcanal's beaches, young Marines carried wounded comrades back to aid stations under strafing fire from enemy aircraft. Corpsmen performed surgery in the sand, using morphine and bandages rationed to the last drop. Squad leaders improvised tactics, learning that grenades, fire, and teamwork were the only way to root out fanatics who refused surrender. For many, it was the first taste of the brutal intimacy of Pacific combat, where war collapsed to the range of a bayonet thrust or a grenade's blast. Every man sensed that this was no temporary raid, but the start of a long grinding fight for survival. Courage became not a single moment, but a pattern, repeated in sweat, blood, and exhaustion. The stories of these small units would echo long after the beaches fell silent, and those stories became the marrow of the Guadalcanal legend. The cost of the landings was significant, but the rewards were greater. Tulagi, Gavutu, and the beginnings of Henderson Field were now in Allied hands. Marines buried their dead quickly under makeshift crosses, marking the first of thousands that would follow on this island campaign. Supplies continued to pour ashore, though chaos and disorder left vital equipment exposed to weather and enemy attack. Japanese aircraft struck repeatedly, swooping down to bomb beaches and strafe transports, a reminder that control of the skies was still contested. Marines dug deeper defenses around the airfield, stringing barbed wire and positioning machine guns to guard against night assaults. Every man knew that Japanese counterattacks were inevitable, driven by pride and necessity. Yet morale was buoyed by the achievement. The first American offensive in the Pacific had taken its ground. For Washington and Canberra, it was proof that the tide could shift, that the Allies were not doomed to retreat forever. But for the men ashore, it was only the opening chapter of an ordeal that would stretch across 6 bitter months. The real battle for Guadalcanal had only just begun. As the sun set on August 7th, smoke still curled from the beaches and wrecked bunkers of Tulagi and Gavutu. Marines lay in foxholes, rifles clutched, listening to the drone of distant engines and the hiss of jungle insects. Offshore destroyers patrolled nervously, their captains aware that Japanese surface forces might already be racing south through the slot. In the command posts, maps were unrolled, radios crackled, and messages flew back to Pearl Harbor announcing a tenuous success. Yet for every Allied cheer, Japanese commanders in Rabaul were already drafting plans for counterattacks, determined to reclaim the lost airfield. Guadalcanal was no longer just an island, it was now a symbol, a line neither side could afford to yield. Men ashore sensed the storm building, their instincts sharpened by the unnatural quiet of the jungle. Every snapping twig, every rustling branch seemed alive with menace, feeding the nerves of men untested in prolonged combat. The landing had been daring and costly, but the hardest trials lay ahead. Guadalcanal had been seized in a single day, holding it would take months of sacrifice and resolve. When Marines first reached the Coral Plain at Lunga Point, they found the skeleton of an airfield still raw and unfinished. Japanese engineers had carved a strip out of the jungle using bulldozers and graders, leaving machinery scattered and fuel drums stacked in hasty dumps. The runway stretched nearly 3,000 feet, a pale scar of crushed coral cutting through the dense green of the island. Crates of construction equipment lay abandoned, evidence of how quickly the defenders had fled at the sound of naval bombardment. The sight electrified Allied commanders, for here was proof that intelligence warnings had been right. Japan had been weeks away from activating a forward bomber base. Marines immediately secured the site, stringing out pickets and digging shallow foxholes along the clearing's perimeter. Engineers moved in, evaluating drainage, soil firmness, and the layout of half-finished taxiways. The humid air was thick with the stench of oil and decaying vegetation, a constant reminder of both opportunity and danger. What had been the enemy's ambition was now the Allies' chance, and in that chance, lay the survival of the Guadalcanal operation. The task of finishing the airfield fell to the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, supported by Marine engineers already ashore. These men were armed not only with rifles but with bulldozers, graders and shovels, their tools as vital as any weapon in the campaign. Under sweltering tropical sun, they cleared coral rubble, leveled surfaces, and rolled layers of crushed stone into a makeshift runway. Every day the strip extended, but every night it had to be defended, for Japanese bombers and warships shelled the site with increasing ferocity. Men worked in shifts, digging drainage ditches by hand, while others unloaded fuel drums and pierced steel planking from bobbing landing craft. Rainstorms turned cleared ground into muck, forcing engineers to improvise with coral fill and wooden supports scavenged from abandoned Japanese stores. They ate cold rations on the run, sleeping in shallow dugouts close to their equipment so work could resume after each bombardment. Their rifles leaned against bulldozers, for enemy patrols might strike at any hour from the surrounding jungle. The Seabees' motto, "We build, we fight," was no slogan here, but a daily reality etched in sweat and grit. In the crucible of Guadalcanal, construction became combat. On August 12th, only 5 days after the landings, the strip was declared operational enough to receive the first aircraft. Marine Wildcat fighters and dauntless dive bombers flew in, their wheels kicking coral dust as pilots cut throttles and taxied onto makeshift dispersal areas. The men cheered as aircraft arrived, for the sound of radial engines meant they were no longer dependent on distant carriers. Supplies were quickly cached in fuel drums, stacked under camouflage nets, and bombs were rolled into revetments carved from sandbags and palm logs. The first missions were not grand raids, but defensive patrols, fighters circling above to intercept bombers probing from Rabaul. Every sortie strained mechanics, who had to keep aircraft flying without proper facilities, cannibalizing parts and patching bullet holes with sheet metal. Pilots lived in foxholes near the runway, rushing to cockpits at the blare of alarms. The airstrip was christened Henderson Field, named for Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading Dauntlesses at Midway. His sacrifice symbolized the link between past battles and this new offensive, binding honor to necessity. With his name, the airfield became more than ground, it became sacred purpose. As more aircraft trickled in, the collection of Marine, Navy, and Army planes became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the code name for Guadalcanal. It was an eclectic mix: Wildcats, Dauntlesses, Army P-400S, and even a handful of long-range B-17S, staging through in emergencies. Pilots came from different services and units, forced to coordinate by radio improvisations and chalkboard schedules. Fuel shortages, limited flight hours, and ammunition had to be rationed carefully, often recovered from unexploded bombs or stripped from wrecks. Air crews faced long odds, for Japanese bombers came daily, escorted by agile Zeros that outperformed many of their planes. Yet the Cactus Air Force fought with ferocity, scrambling at the first sign of incoming raids, climbing into hostile skies again and again. Mechanics worked under fire, repairing aircraft in open clearings, while shrapnel and bombs tore up the ground around them. Pilots flew sorties with minimal rest, often returning to land on a runway cratered by the very bombers they had failed to intercept. In its early days, the Cactus Air Force was less a unit than a desperate fraternity, but it quickly became the shield upon which the entire campaign depended. Henderson Field was far from secure, for Japanese warships prowled offshore at night, shelling the strip with high explosive rounds. Battleships and cruisers lobbed shells that cratered the runway, setting fuel drums ablaze and scattering shrapnel across tents and revetments. Men dove into foxholes, hugging the earth as explosions thundered around them, praying the next salvo would not land directly on their position. At dawn, engineers emerged, filling craters, leveling coral, and pushing bulldozers across smoking ground so aircraft could take off again. The rhythm became routine: destruction by night, repair by day, and combat by afternoon. Enemy bombers, flying from Rabaul, added their weight, turning midday into another gauntlet of fire. Marines called it bombing time, a cruel clockwork that left nerves raw and tempers frayed. Yet each time the runway reopened, it sent a message: the field would not be silenced. Henderson was more than an airstrip. It was defiance carved into coral, and that defiance became the symbol of Guadalcanal itself. Logistics for Henderson Field was a nightmare, and improvisation became the key to survival. Supplies piled chaotically on the beach, where Japanese bombers frequently struck, scattering men and destroying vital stores. Aviation fuel was stored in thin-skinned drums that leaked in the heat, rolled into pits, and covered with palm fronds for concealment. Bombs were manhandled by Marines and engineers, rolled across dirt in the rain, and stacked in improvised revetments reinforced with coconut logs. Spare parts were non-existent, forcing mechanics to cannibalize wrecked planes for engines, propellers, and radios. Even ammunition for anti-aircraft guns ran short, leading crews to reuse shell casings by hand-loading powder charges. Every sortie flown was a logistical miracle, a testament to men who refused to let shortages ground their aircraft. Supply convoys, already vulnerable, often failed to deliver enough, leaving pilots with limits on patrol time and bomb loads. Men joked bitterly that Henderson was held together with coral, sweat, and prayers. Yet those prayers often proved enough to keep planes in the air when they were most needed. Necessity became the mother of endurance. The airfield also reshaped the psychology of the battle, for its very presence forced the Japanese to act with growing desperation. Tokyo could not allow an Allied base to thrive within striking distance of their supply lines to New Guinea. Reinforcement convoys, dubbed the Tokyo Express, were forced to race down the slot at night, knowing daylight would bring Cactus Air Force bombers. Every Japanese soldier who landed on Guadalcanal came ashore under the shadow of Henderson's fighters. Every ship that approached the island risked interception by dive bombers swooping from the clouds. The field's existence created a paradox. Though fragile and often bombed, it dominated the campaign by compelling the enemy to fight on Allied terms. It turned Guadalcanal into a magnet, drawing ships, planes, and men into its orbit. And in that magnetism, the battle's stakes grew higher with each passing week. By late August 1942, Henderson Field was operational, though never secure, and its defenders knew every day was borrowed time. Pilots slept beside their aircraft, engineers carried rifles alongside shovels, and Marines on the perimeter dug deeper with every night raid. The field's survival depended on relentless improvisation, ceaseless labor, and the courage of men who refused to yield. It was bombed, shelled, strafed, and cratered, yet each morning it roared back to life with the thunder of engines. From this strip, patrols fanned across the sea, intercepting convoys and striking Japanese shipping. From this strip, the Allies gained their first foothold in the Pacific, transforming defense into offense. Henderson became the heart of Guadalcanal, a living organism pulsing with sweat, smoke, and sacrifice. Its defenders nicknamed themselves the Cactus Air Force, embracing hardship as identity. And in that identity, Guadalcanal ceased to be a gamble and became the turning point of a war. In the early hours of August 9, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal glowed faintly under a waning moon, The surface calm and deceptively still. Allied warships patrolled the approaches, heavy cruisers and destroyers guarding the transports that had delivered Marines to Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Sailors stood at ease on deck, their nerves dulled by fatigue, for days of operations under tropical sun had drained strength and sharpened complacency. Radar, still primitive and misunderstood, gave confused returns in the cluttered island channels, offering little reassurance to captains. Lookouts strained their eyes in the dark, but the humid haze reduced visibility to a few thousand yards. Unbeknownst to them, Admiral Genichi Mikawa's striking force, 7 cruisers and a destroyer, was racing down the slot, their crews drilled to perfection in night combat. Japanese ships ran with disciplined silence, their black hulls cutting the waves with precision, as signal lamps flickered brief commands. On board, gunners checked their mounts, their long-lance torpedoes armed and ready, the pride of the Imperial Navy's arsenal. Mikawa's plan was audacious: strike suddenly, annihilate the covering force, and retreat before daylight brought Allied carrier planes. The stage was set for a disaster that would sear its name into naval history. The Allies, confident after successful landings, had divided their cruisers into patrol groups covering different approaches to Savo Island. The heavy cruisers Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and Canberra formed the backbone of the force, supported by destroyers tasked with radar and picket duties. Command relationships were confused, with multiple admirals holding overlapping responsibilities across the screen. Communication between groups was limited, and few officers believed a major Japanese counterstroke could occur so soon after the landings. Some captains assumed Japanese morale had been shattered, underestimating the skill of enemy night-fighting crews. Others placed too much faith in radar, forgetting its limitations in cluttered island waters. The men on watch fought exhaustion, many dozing at their posts after long hours in tropical humidity. Below decks, sailors slept in hammocks, unaware that enemy guns were closing at terrifying speed. Orders to maintain a high state of readiness had slackened, reflecting a dangerous sense of security. This complacency would soon prove fatal. Mikawa's column, led by the cruiser Chokai, sliced through the channel with uncanny discipline, aided by moonlight glinting faintly off low-lying clouds. Japanese lookouts spotted Allied silhouettes against the horizon, their profiles unmistakable as heavy cruisers. Mikawa's gunners readied torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, capable of running 20,000 yards at high speed with deadly accuracy. At 0143, Japanese searchlights blazed to life, illuminating Allied ships caught unaware in the darkness. Within seconds, long lances streaked into the water, white wakes cutting through the calm sea as Japanese gunners unleashed salvos of shells. The effect was immediate and devastating. Canberra was struck first, her hull torn by torpedoes and fires erupting across her decks. Astoria and Quincy took shells in their turrets and bridges, command centers obliterated before officers could react. Vincennes' broadside to the attack erupted in flames as shells detonated ammunition lockers. The night became chaos, ships burning, searchlights glaring, and sailors screaming orders drowned out by explosions. In minutes, Allied cruisers were reduced from sentinels to shattered wrecks. Confusion gripped the Allied formation as orders became garbled and coordination collapsed under the shock of sudden destruction. Radar operators shouted warnings too late, their screens awash with echoes that failed to distinguish friend from foe. Some destroyers launched ineffective counterattacks, their torpedoes missing in the confusion of smoke and glare. Commanders on burning cruisers struggled to maintain discipline, issuing helm orders through shattered bridges while fires engulfed superstructures. Men fought to control flooding, dragging hoses across molten decks, but explosions ripped through compartments faster than damage control could respond. Ammunition cooked off, hurling fragments across ships already crippled by torpedo holes. Communications broke down entirely, radios failing amid power outages and direct hits. In the dark chaos, some ships fired at shadows, nearly striking friendly vessels in the melee. The battle was not a contest but a slaughter, conducted with merciless precision by Japanese night-fighting doctrine. The Allies had walked blindly into a trap, and the trap had snapped shut. By dawn, the scope of the disaster became clear as damaged cruisers drifted. Burning wrecks silhouetted against a rising sun. Canberra lay crippled, dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship as fires spread uncontrollably. Quincy slipped beneath the waves, hundreds of her crew lost as explosions tore her apart. Astoria fought flames for hours before succumbing, her hull rolling slowly before sliding into the depths. Vincennes, her decks gutted by fire, followed soon after, sinking as survivors clung to lifeboats and wreckage. Nearly 1,100 Allied sailors perished in those few terrible hours, their sacrifice marking one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Survivors floated among oil slicks, their faces lit by the glow of still burning ships, calling out in voices hoarse with smoke and salt water. Rescue destroyers moved cautiously through debris fields, hauling men from the sea, while fearing further attacks. The waters north of Guadalcanal, littered with twisted steel and the bodies of brave men, would soon earn the grim name Ironbottom Sound. The Allies had seized the land, but the sea had turned against them, and the cost was only beginning to be understood. The shock waves of Savo Island spread quickly across the Pacific and back to Washington. Newspapers reported the loss of 4 heavy cruisers in a single night, a catastrophe unprecedented in American naval history. Civilians, still celebrating the landings, were stunned to learn of defeat on such a scale, and families of sailors waited anxiously for casualty lists. For the Navy, the humiliation cut deep, raising questions about readiness, training, and doctrine. How had such powerful ships been destroyed so quickly, and why had radar and patrols failed to give warning? Critics demanded answers, while commanders grappled with the need to maintain public confidence. Within the fleet, the loss was a bitter lesson, forcing painful re-examinations of night combat, coordination, and the reliance on outdated assumptions. The Japanese, by contrast, celebrated the victory, confident that American naval power had been dealt a crippling blow. Yet Mikawa, cautious of daylight air attacks, withdrew before destroying the vulnerable transports offshore. The irony was sharp. Though the Allies lost cruisers, the Marines' foothold on Guadalcanal remained intact. Savo Island became a crucible for doctrinal change, as the U.S. Navy resolved never again to be humiliated at night. Training in radar interpretation intensified, with officers drilled in the nuances of distinguishing friend from foe in cluttered seas. Destroyers were reassigned to aggressive picket duty, armed with new torpedo tactics to counter Japanese strengths. Coordination between ships was tightened, with clearer chains of command imposed to avoid the confusion that had doomed the cruisers. Night combat, once neglected, became a focus of study, as lessons from Savo were pored over by analysts and commanders alike. Survivors testified to the importance of readiness, of keeping men alert even in exhaustion, and of respecting the enemy's skill. The Navy's culture shifted, embracing the harsh truth that technology alone could not compensate for discipline and preparation. For the Japanese, Savo confirmed their supremacy in night action, emboldening them for further battles down the slot. Yet in their confidence lay a seed of complacency, one that would eventually be exploited by an American fleet determined to adapt. From tragedy emerged resolve, and from defeat came the foundation of eventual victory. For the Marines ashore, The naval defeat was both frightening and isolating. They had stormed beaches under the assumption that naval guns and cruisers would shield them from counterattacks. Now, the sudden loss of those ships left them exposed, dependent on carriers that might withdraw and aircraft from an unfinished airfield. In campfires and foxholes, whispers spread that the Navy might abandon them, leaving them stranded against inevitable Japanese counterstrokes. General Vandegrift fought to maintain morale, reminding his men that their mission had not changed and their defenses would hold. Supplies grew precarious, for transports pulled away under threat of further naval attack, leaving Marines with rations and ammunition barely sufficient for weeks. The jungle pressed in, and every rustle carried the fear of enemy patrols. Yet in that fear lay determination, as Marines dug deeper and prepared for the worst. Savo Island was a grim reminder that Guadalcanal would not be won cheaply. Victory would demand sacrifice not only on land but in the unforgiving waters surrounding it. And the men ashore braced themselves for a campaign that had only just begun. In mid-August 1942, as Marines dug into their perimeter around Henderson Field, Japanese commanders at Rabaul were already drafting plans for a counterattack. News of the American landings shocked Tokyo, for the loss of Guadalcanal threatened the Empire's defensive ring and challenged its aura of invincibility. The Imperial General Staff demanded immediate action, convinced that a swift blow would sweep the intruders back into the sea. Colonel Kionao Ichiki, a veteran of China and a proud regimental commander, was tasked with leading the first counterstroke. His unit, the Ichiki Detachment, had been earmarked for the planned invasion of Midway before that operation collapsed in disaster. Now hastily redirected, his men were loaded onto transports and sent racing south toward Guadalcanal. Ichiki himself believed the operation would be a punitive raid, a chance to prove the superiority of Japanese arms. He carried with him not caution, but contempt for American fighting ability, a view shaped by months of victories across Asia and the Pacific. His orders were to attack immediately upon landing, without waiting for the rest of his regiment. That impatience would soon doom his men. The Ichiki detachment landed on the dark beaches east of the marine perimeter on the night of August 18, 1942. Approximately 900 men, armed with rifles, light machine guns, and mortars, slipped ashore under cover of surf and jungle. The landing was unopposed, and Ichiki, buoyed by confidence, chose not to wait for reinforcements or reconnaissance. He believed that a bold night assault would scatter the Marines, who he assumed were demoralized conscripts lacking discipline. His men advanced west along the coast, guided by local trails and the sound of the surf, toward the mouth of the Ilu River, misidentified in reports as the Tenaru. Spirits were high among his soldiers, who carried bayonets gleaming in moonlight and shouted battle cries as they prepared for the assault. To Ichiki, delay meant weakness and boldness meant certain victory. Yet his maps were poor, his knowledge of the terrain minimal, and his intelligence fatally flawed. He did not know that the Marines had fortified the riverbank with machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery support. Nor did he suspect that his small detachment faced an enemy more determined and more numerous than he imagined. On the morning of August 21st, Ichiki ordered a frontal assault across the sandbar at the river mouth. His men surged forward in waves, banners unfurled, bayonets fixed, and voices raised in shouts of banzai. The Japanese infantry charged with ferocity, but they advanced into a killing ground prepared by the Marines. Concealed machine guns opened up, stitching the sandbar with fire, mowing down soldiers before they reached the wire. Mortars dropped shells with deadly accuracy, bursting among tightly packed ranks and scattering bodies across the beach. Marines held their fire until the last moment, then unleashed volleys that shredded the leading waves. The riverbank became a scene of horror, the water turning red as bodies piled against barbed wire and drifted downstream. Still, Ichiki urged his men on, ordering renewed charges into the teeth of concentrated fire. Courage was not lacking, but doctrine had betrayed them, for frontal assaults against entrenched positions yielded only slaughter. Within minutes, hundreds lay dead or dying under the tropical sun. Yet the attack did not stop. It escalated. As day wore on, Ichiki committed more men into the fight, convinced that weight of numbers would break the marine line. Japanese soldiers crawled forward through mangroves and sand, using shallow depressions for cover, firing light machine guns from awkward angles. Marines responded with precision, their Browning automatic rifles and .30 caliber machine guns cutting through foliage with lethal bursts. Artillery batteries behind the lines thundered, lobbing shells that landed among groups massing for another charge. The smoke of burning palms and the stench of blood filled the humid air, mingling with the cries of wounded men on both sides. Marines rotated along the line, bringing fresh shooters to machine gun pits, while corpsmen tended to casualties under fire. The Japanese, driven by honor and indoctrination, refused to withdraw even as losses mounted catastrophically. Every attempt to breach the perimeter collapsed under withering firepower, the sandbar a graveyard of determination. Ichiki still clung to belief in victory, blind to the annihilation unfolding around him. His faith in aggressive doctrine had become a death sentence for his men. As darkness fell, Marines launched a counterattack designed to end the slaughter. Tanks rumbled forward through shallow surf, their machine guns blazing, crushing bodies beneath their treads as they advanced. Infantry followed, bayonets fixed, moving with grim precision to clear out pockets of resistance along the riverbank. Japanese soldiers fought with desperation, hurling grenades and charging into tank fire, but their efforts dissolved into isolated last stands. The river itself became clogged with corpses, its current carrying the fallen downstream toward the sea. Searchlights illuminated the battlefield, exposing those who tried to crawl away under cover of night. Marines methodically advanced, firing into foxholes and mangroves, until silence replaced gunfire. Survivors fled into the jungle, disorganized and leaderless, leaving behind shattered weapons and burning supplies. Ichiki himself retreated with a handful of men, his pride crushed along with his detachment. By dawn, the battlefield lay quiet, littered with hundreds of Japanese bodies. The defeat was total, and its lesson brutal. The Battle of the Tenaru was more than a tactical victory. It was a revelation. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese forces had launched a major assault and been decisively repelled. Marines had held their ground against one of the Empire's most celebrated regiments, disproving myths of American weakness and cowardice. Ichiki's overconfidence, fueled by a doctrine that prized boldness over caution, had led his men into a trap from which none could escape. The long-lance torpedoes and battleships that had shattered Allied cruisers at Savo Island could not save infantry hurled blindly against fortified lines. Japanese planners had underestimated the stamina, fire discipline, and firepower of American units determined to defend their foothold. For Marines, the victory validated their training and reinforced belief in their mission to hold Guadalcanal at all costs. For the Japanese, it was a shocking blow, erasing illusions of effortless superiority and forcing reconsideration of strategy. The aura of invincibility surrounding Tokyo's armies began to crack, and through that crack, a glimmer of Allied momentum shone. The cost of Ichiki's folly was staggering. Over 800 of his 900 men were killed, their bodies buried in mass graves or consumed by the jungle. Marines walked among the carnage, shaken by the sight of bayonets clenched in dead hands and bodies piled against barbed wire. The ferocity of the Japanese charges left no doubt about their courage, but courage alone could not overcome rifles, machine guns, and artillery positioned with discipline. Survivors were few, and those captured revealed the arrogance of orders that had demanded immediate assault. For Marines, the experience was searing, a lesson in both the resilience of their enemy and the brutality of the fight ahead. They understood now that Guadalcanal would not be won easily. Every ridge, river, and clearing would be contested at terrible cost. Corps men tended to their wounded, while burial parties labored in silence, the smell of death clinging to uniforms for days. Commanders sent messages back to Washington reporting victory, but tempered with warnings of what such battles foretold. The Tenaru had been held, but it was only the first test. Greater storms were gathering on the horizon. Back in Japan, the loss was concealed from the public, cloaked in vague reports of gallant action against overwhelming odds. But within the army, the shock was profound, forcing acknowledgement that Americans could fight with tenacity equal to their own. Doctrinal debates began to stir quietly, though pride prevented immediate change in tactics. For Admiral Mikawa and other commanders, the setback complicated efforts to reinforce Guadalcanal, demanding larger and more organized efforts. For Tokyo, it marked the beginning of a campaign that would consume resources far beyond initial estimates. The Imperial staff began funneling more troops south, setting the stage for months of grinding attrition. On Guadalcanal, Marines hardened their resolve, knowing reinforcements would come for the enemy in greater strength. The Tenaru thus became both a victory and a warning, a glimpse into the scale of what lay ahead. Ichiki's detachment had been annihilated, but the Japanese war machine was far from spent, and for the men who fought on those sandy banks, the memory of that night remained etched forever in blood and fire. In September 1942, the struggle for Guadalcanal reached a fever pitch as Japanese reinforcements poured ashore, determined to seize Henderson Field at any cost. The Imperial Command had dispatched elements of the Kawaguchi Brigade, nearly 6,000 strong, tasked with smashing the marine perimeter in a concentrated assault. Their objective was clear: cut through jungle ridges south of the airfield and drive straight into the heart of American defenses. The Japanese had learned from Ichiki's disaster at the Tenaru, but their faith in night infiltration and human wave assaults remained unchanged. Reconnaissance identified a narrow ridgeline south of Henderson as the weak seam, a corridor of high ground leading directly to the airstrip. Colonel Kianao Kawaguchi, a veteran of China, promised his superiors that his brigade would annihilate the defenders in a single night. Yet standing in their path was Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson and his 1st Marine Raider Battalion, later reinforced by paratroopers. These men were already exhausted, worn thin by weeks of combat, disease, and dwindling rations. But on that ridge, they would write a chapter of defiance that saved the airfield and perhaps the Pacific War itself. The terrain of the ridge dictated the flow of battle as much as any plan or order. The spine of coral rose from jungle lowlands in jagged contours, its slopes covered in kunai grass and sparse trees that offered little concealment. At its northern tip, the ridge narrowed into a knife edge, providing a natural avenue of approach for attacking forces. To Marines, it offered visibility but little depth, a defensive line perilously thin against massed assault. Digging was difficult in the coral soil, forcing shallow foxholes that provided scant protection against shell bursts. The surrounding jungle teemed with insects, and malaria was already ravaging the ranks, leaving men feverish and weak. At night, the darkness was absolute, broken only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare. Marines called it Edson's Ridge, for the red-haired colonel who directed their defenses with calm authority. He recognized the ridge as the key to Henderson's survival, and ordered his raiders and paratroopers to hold it at any cost. What followed would be one of the fiercest close-quarter fights of the Pacific War. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi launched his brigade into the assault with chilling precision. Columns of Japanese infantry moved silently through the jungle, bayonets fixed, their officers whispering orders as they advanced. The night air was heavy with humidity, muffling footsteps, and carrying the sound of insects louder than human movement. At 2100, the first wave struck the Marine outposts along the southern slopes, opening with grenades and machine gun bursts. Raiders fell back in fighting withdrawal, setting ambushes and delaying the enemy as they climbed the ridgeline. Edson positioned his men along the crest, commanding from a forward observation post, calm under fire and constantly moving to steady shaken units. The Japanese attacked in relentless waves, their cries piercing the night as they charged through grass and brush. Mortar shells arced into Marine positions, exploding among shallow foxholes and tearing through thin lines. Yet each attack was met with disciplined volleys, machine guns hammering until barrels glowed red. The ridge echoed with the roar of battle, and the fight for Henderson had begun in earnest. As the night deepened, the Japanese intensified their attacks, exploiting the narrow terrain to focus pressure against Edson's thinning defenses. Marines fired until their rifles jammed, then cleared them with frantic hands before resuming the fight. Ammunition runners crawled through fire to bring belts and clips to forward positions, their silhouettes outlined by flares drifting overhead. Corpsmen worked desperately in the open, dragging the wounded back down the slope, their hands slick with blood. Japanese soldiers infiltrated gaps, slashing with bayonets and knives, forcing hand-to-hand combat in the dark. Grenades exploded in foxholes, killing men in bursts of earth and flame, while machine gun crews fought until overrun, and then fought again with pistols and fists. The ridgeline became chaos, a swirl of gunfire, shouts and screams where order broke down to raw survival. Edson himself moved among his men, rifle in hand, shouting encouragement and shifting units to plug breaches. His presence steadied the line, reminding the raiders that retreat was not an option. Against the weight of numbers, their courage became the only bulwark. By the early hours of September 13th, the Marine line was close to breaking. The paratroopers, inexperienced and understrength, wavered as the Japanese pressed closer to the airfield. Edson ordered a tactical withdrawal, pulling his men back to the final ridge crest, nearer Henderson, where a tighter line could be held. Exhausted Marines stumbled through darkness, some carrying wounded comrades, others simply collapsing from exhaustion. Japanese forces surged into abandoned positions, convinced victory was near, only to be met by a new curtain of fire. Machine guns and mortars hammered advancing troops, creating a deadly killing zone on the ridge slope. The airstrip itself lay barely 1,500 yards behind the Marine line, visible in the faint glow of the night sky. Pilots, mechanics, and airmen from the Cactus Air Force braced for the worst, some preparing to fight with rifles if the line collapsed. But on that last ridge crest, Edson's men dug in with grim resolve. The fate of Guadalcanal now hung on a few hundred weary defenders and their commander's unshakable will. The final hours before dawn saw the battle reach its peak, a maelstrom of fire and fury under a sky streaked with flares. Japanese soldiers hurled themselves forward in desperate charges, stumbling over the bodies of their comrades already cut down. Machine gun crews fired until ammunition ran dry, then fought with bayonets and entrenching tools. Mortar crews dropped shells so close to their own lines that fragments rained among Marines as well as Japanese attackers. The ridge was carpeted with bodies, some alive and writhing, others motionless, all lit by the eerie light of star shells. Edson called in artillery from the perimeter, and shells shrieked overhead to crash among enemy concentrations forming for another assault. The barrage tore gaps in the jungle, scattering Kawaguchi's troops and breaking their momentum. By 0500, the attacks faltered, reduced to scattered groups crawling forward only to be driven back. As dawn broke, the survivors of Kawaguchi's brigade melted into the jungle, their assault shattered. Henderson Field still stood, saved by the courage of men who had refused to yield in the night. The cost of the battle was horrific, with over 800 Japanese dead littering the ridge, and hundreds more wounded in the jungle beyond. Marines counted nearly 80 killed, and hundreds wounded, their ranks thinned by exhaustion, disease, and blood loss. The ground itself bore witness, grass flattened by bodies, trees shredded by bullets, and the coral earth stained dark with blood. Marines who survived spoke of hallucinations from fatigue, of fighting in a haze where every shadow seemed alive. Colesmen described working without pause, patching wounds with torn shirts, and morphine syringes as grenades burst nearby. Men who had once doubted their endurance now realized they had endured the unendurable. Henderson's survival was not merely tactical but symbolic, a statement that the Allies would not be driven into the sea. Kawaguchi retreated in shame, his promise of swift victory broken against the ridge's coral spine. For the Japanese, the defeat was both tactical and psychological, a crack in the myth of inevitable triumph. For the Marines, it was proof that grit and leadership could hold the line against overwhelming odds. In the days after the battle, Marines christened the ground Bloody Ridge, a name that captured both its horror and its heroism. Burial details worked under sweltering sun, digging shallow graves and piling enemy bodies into mass pits, the stench clinging to the air for days. Survivors cleaned weapons, replaced sandbags, and prepared for the next assault, knowing the Japanese would return in greater numbers. Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor, but his true reward was the knowledge that Henderson still functioned, its airstrip vital to the campaign. Pilots of the Cactus Air Force flew overhead that very day, saluting with wing waggles before banking into combat air patrol. The ridge became legend, retold in hushed voices by Marines who had survived its nightmare. Journalists later described it as one of the fiercest small unit actions of the war, where leadership and stubborn defense outweighed numbers. The Japanese, humiliated, reinforced their determination to retake Guadalcanal, setting the stage for months of attritional struggle. For now, however, Henderson Field breathed, its survival paid for in sweat and blood, and the Battle of Bloody Ridge became a symbol of endurance carved into the very soil of Guadalcanal. By late August 1942, the skies above Guadalcanal had become as decisive a battlefield as its ridges and rivers. Every day, American and Japanese aircraft clashed over jungle clearings, over convoys threading the slot, and over the beaches where supplies piled precariously. The Cactus Air Force, named for the codename of Guadalcanal, was a patchwork of Marine, Navy, and Army squadrons operating from Henderson Field. Its pilots flew Wildcats, dauntless dive bombers, and Army P-400 Cs, many patched with scavenged parts and fueled from leaking drums hidden under palm fronds. Opposing them were Mitsubishi Zeros and Betty bombers from Rabaul, sleek and deadly aircraft flown by seasoned veterans of campaigns across Asia. The Japanese brought experience and numbers, but they faced the grueling reality of flying 600 miles round-trip missions over ocean with little margin for error. For both sides, the air war was unforgiving, demanding courage, improvisation, and endurance in equal measure. Every sortie was a gamble against weather, exhaustion, and enemy fire. And above it all hung the reality: Whoever held the skies controlled the fate of Guadalcanal. The Cactus Air Force operated under conditions more desperate than glamorous. Mechanics worked in open clearings with little more than canvas shelters, repairing bullet-riddled fuselages with scavenged sheet metal and welding torches. Bombs were stored in shallow pits, rolled by hand across rough ground, and armed under the glare of tropical sun. Fuel was rationed so carefully that some missions were cancelled simply to preserve enough gasoline for emergencies. Pilots often flew 2 or 3 sorties a day, scrambling at the sound of distant engines, their bodies running on adrenaline and coffee. Sleeping in foxholes near their aircraft, they leapt into cockpits within minutes of alarms, often taking off while enemy bombers already appeared overhead. Radios were unreliable, forcing squadrons to improvise formations in mid-air with hand signals and waggled wings. Ammunition belts were rationed, and gunners often counted every round, knowing resupply might not arrive for days. Morale was sustained not by comfort but by a grim sense of necessity. At Henderson, every flight was life or death, for without air cover the island could not be held. Japanese Airpower flowed from Rabaul, a fortress airbase that launched Betty bombers and their Zero escorts in daily waves. The Betty's twin-engined medium bombers could deliver devastating torpedo and bomb attacks, but their unarmored fuselages made them fragile under heavy fire. Escorting Zeros, agile and fast, were flown by elite pilots who had cut their teeth over China and the Philippines. They believed in their superiority and often were justified, for in one-on-one combat the Zero outperformed the lumbering American Wildcats. Yet the range to Guadalcanal stretched their endurance, leaving pilots exhausted and sometimes short on fuel for the return leg. Losses, once sustainable, began to mount as the Cactus Air Force grew more aggressive and better coordinated. Betty formations flew into dense flak and concentrated fighter attacks, their bomb runs disrupted and their losses climbing with each raid. Japanese commanders pressed their crews to continue, convinced that relentless pressure would grind down the American foothold. But every raid came at a cost, draining not only planes but veteran pilots Tokyo could not replace. Attrition began to take hold, even if the skies remained contested. Carrier air power added another dimension to the struggle, blurring the lines between sea and land. Admiral Fletcher's carriers had departed early in the campaign, leaving Henderson as the primary base, but occasional carrier battles flared nearby. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August, and later at Santa Cruz in October, carrier aircraft struck Japanese reinforcements while suffering their own heavy losses. Each clash reminded both sides that naval aviation was the long arm of Pacific warfare, able to shift the balance suddenly with dive bombers and torpedo planes. Yet on Guadalcanal itself, it was Henderson that bore the daily burden of keeping skies contested. Carrier raids could decide single days. Henderson dictated the survival of months. Pilots who had once flown from decks now landed on coral runways, fighting alongside Marines to protect the field. The distinction between naval, army, and marine aviation blurred, replaced by the single identity of the Cactus Air Force. In that unity, improvisation became strategy, and through that strategy, a ragged air wing became a decisive factor in the campaign. The air war dictated supply runs, for every convoy lived or died by the question of air superiority. Japanese transports carrying reinforcements and supplies raced down the slot under cover of night, their decks stacked with crates and soldiers crammed into holds. By day they were hunted mercilessly by dauntless dive bombers and wildcats swooping from Henderson Field. Convoys that slipped through darkness often arrived shattered by daylight, ships burning or sinking before they could unload fully. The Americans faced their own peril, for every resupply convoy was targeted by bombers flying from Rabaul. Destroyers and transports hugged coastlines, maneuvering through rain squalls to evade detection, only to be caught by Japanese bombers diving through cloud breaks. Fuel shortages often grounded fighters at the worst moments, leaving ships exposed and helpless. Pilots understood that their presence over convoys could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In this way, the fate of the ground war was directly tied to dogfights fought thousands of feet above jungle and sea. On Guadalcanal, air superiority was not an abstract concept but a matter of food, bullets, and life. Close air support became another vital mission, binding airmen and infantry in shared struggle. Wildcats and Dauntlesses swooped low over ridgelines, strafing Japanese columns attempting to infiltrate the marine perimeter. Pilots learned to spot muzzle flashes and movement in kunai grass, diving steeply to drop bombs with terrifying precision. Infantry cheered as bombs tore apart enemy strongpoints, knowing that without air power they faced assaults unchecked. Yet such missions drained fuel and ammunition, stretching thin the already precarious logistics of Henderson. Pilots often flew with half loads, improvising with small bombs or even jerry-rigged ordnance. Accuracy was improved by the intimacy of the battlefield, where pilots often recognized the very ridges they had walked while grounded. This fusion of air and ground war blurred boundaries, making Guadalcanal a laboratory for modern joint operations. Each sortie tied the Marines closer to the Cactus Air Force, building a bond of mutual dependence. In foxholes and cockpits alike, the line between survival and defeat grew thinner with each passing day, and through that line the resolve of both services intertwined into one. The cost of the air war was visible every day in wreckage strewn across jungle clearings and waters off the coast. Downed Wildcats and Dauntlesses littered Henderson's edges, their fuselages stripped for parts before being abandoned to rust. Japanese Bettys lay shattered in the jungle, their aluminum frames scorched by fire, their crews buried hastily in unmarked graves. Pilots on both sides lived on the edge of exhaustion, their nerves frayed by constant alarms and the knowledge that every flight might be their last. Dogfights often ended with both aircraft spiraling into the sea, their final resting places marked only by oil slicks. Survivors who bailed out over jungle risked capture or death from disease before rescue could arrive. Morale swung wildly, elation at victories, despair at mounting losses, fatigue gnawing constantly at the edges. Yet both sides fought on, convinced that mastery of the air meant mastery of Guadalcanal. For the Americans, Henderson became a shrine to endurance. For the Japanese, its destruction became an obsession that drained lives and aircraft without end. By October, the air war had settled into a grim equilibrium, a battle of attrition that neither side could afford, but neither could abandon. The Japanese launched massive raids, sometimes over 100 aircraft strong, only to see formations shredded by defenders lying in wait. The Americans fought with fewer planes but with increasing efficiency, guided by radar, coast watcher warnings, and sheer determination. Each day's outcome decided whether convoys survived, whether reinforcements reached shore, and whether Marines ate or starved. The line between land, sea, and air blurred completely, for the battle could not be separated into compartments. It was one struggle, fought across 3 dimensions with Henderson Field at its core. The Cactus Air Force, born of improvisation and desperation, had become the hinge upon which the campaign turned. Japanese commanders, frustrated and bleeding resources, prepared ever larger efforts to crush it once and for all. Yet every raid, every dogfight, Every dive-bombing run etched deeper the futility of their task. Guadalcanal's skies had become the crucible of modern war, and in that crucible, the Americans proved they would not break. The Matanikau River, winding from the jungle interior to the western coast of Guadalcanal, became a name etched into marine memory through repetition and blood. It was not the site of one grand battle, but of many smaller clashes that shaped the tempo of the campaign. Each bend of the river, each sandbar and coconut grove, became a classroom where Marines learned the cruel logic of jungle warfare. Here reconnaissance patrols clashed with Japanese scouting parties, exchanging rifle fire at distances so close that leaves smoldered from muzzle blasts. The terrain was unforgiving: thick mangroves near the river mouth, steep ridges inland, and tidal flats that exposed men to fire. Rain turned trails into mud, and the oppressive humidity wore down stamina as much as bullets. The Japanese recognized the river as a natural line of defense, shielding their positions west of Henderson Field. For Marines, probing it meant constant risk, yet avoiding it meant conceding ground to enemy infiltration. Every patrol carried lessons in ambush, concealment, and survival, and the Matanikau became a crucible where tactics evolved under fire. The first Marine probes into the Matanikau in late September 1942 were tentative, designed to test enemy strength along the riverbanks. Small patrols advanced cautiously, moving single file through kunai grass and tangled vines, rifles held high against the wet. Japanese defenders lay hidden in spider holes and camouflaged positions, waiting until Marines were within yards before opening fire. Snipers perched in coconut palms or concealed behind driftwood picked off men one by one, forcing squads to fan out under fire. Mortar shells fell among the trees, their blast shredding foliage and filling the air with splinters of wood and coral. Marines responded with suppressive fire, Browning automatic rifles laying down bursts while riflemen crawled forward through mud. Yet progress was measured in feet, not yards, and casualties mounted quickly. By nightfall, patrols often withdrew with more wounded than intact squads, carrying hard-won knowledge back to Henderson. Commanders noted the enemy's skill in using terrain and cover, making every advance costly. The Matanikau was becoming a deadly teacher, and its lessons were paid for in blood. October brought larger actions as Marine battalions attempted to clear the Japanese from strongpoints near the river's mouth. Colonel Red Mike Edson, fresh from Bloody Ridge, led raids designed to harass enemy concentrations and prevent their build-up west of Henderson. Amphibious landings along the coast inserted companies behind Japanese lines, where they struck with surprise before withdrawing by boat. These raids revealed both the daring and the danger of such operations, as extraction under fire often turned into near disaster. Japanese defenders responded with sharp counterattacks, mortars blanketing beaches and machine guns raking landing zones as Marines scrambled aboard Higgins' boats. On one such raid, confusion and tide changes trapped companies between river and sea, forcing desperate rearguard actions to hold off advancing Japanese. Casualties were heavy, and survivors returned shaken but wiser about the risks of amphibious maneuver under constant enemy pressure. For the Marines, every raid was a gamble between boldness and annihilation. For the Japanese, every counterstroke was proof that they would not yield ground easily. And in this grim balance, the campaign around the Matanikau deepened. The Japanese used the river not merely as a defensive line, but as a base for constant infiltration. Small groups slipped across at night, using native canoes or improvised rafts to probe marine lines or set ambushes on trails. These patrols relied on local guides and the cover of darkness, their movement nearly silent through jungle that seemed impenetrable to outsiders. Marines countered with their own night patrols, stalking shadows, laying ambushes along likely crossing points, and firing flares into the darkness. Skirmishes erupted suddenly, often lasting minutes, leaving bodies scattered in the undergrowth before silence returned. Sniping became a deadly art on both sides, with marksmen spending hours motionless in trees or thickets, waiting for a target to appear. The psychological toll grew immense, as Marines began to fear every rustle of foliage, every bird call that might mask enemy movement. Yet the Marines adapted, learning to fight with stealth and patience equal to their adversaries. Scouts, often led by Solomon Islanders, proved invaluable in tracking Japanese patrols and guiding Marines through terrain that would otherwise swallow them whole. The river thus became not just a battlefield, but a daily contest of nerves. Artillery and air power, though decisive in larger battles, proved blunt tools along the Matanikau's winding banks. Marines brought in 75 pack howitzers, dragging them through mud to fire at suspected enemy positions, only to watch shells disappear into the jungle canopy. The Japanese, skilled at camouflage, often re-emerged from bunkers unscathed, forcing infantry to finish the job at bayonet point. Henderson-based Dauntlesses dropped bombs along ridgelines, but thick vegetation absorbed much of the impact, leaving attackers to face well-entrenched defenders. Thus the burden fell on small unit tactics, squads maneuvering under fire, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear strong points, one bunker at a time. Platoon leaders learned to improvise constantly, turning jungle terrain into either shield or death trap depending on their choices. Coordination between artillery, air, and infantry improved, but never enough to eliminate the agony of close combat. Each engagement left Marines more experienced, but also more exhausted, their nerves frayed by the constant strain. The Matanikau campaign was not about dramatic breakthroughs, but about grinding adaptation. It taught the Marines that survival required patience as much as aggression, and those lessons would shape every battle that followed. The cost of these operations weighed heavily on both sides, but it was the Japanese who suffered most from attrition. Their doctrine still emphasized frontal attacks, and though they used infiltration well, they often massed troops for assaults across exposed ground. Each time they did, Marine machine guns and artillery tore them apart, leaving the riverbanks littered with bodies. Japanese medical evacuation was minimal, and wounded often lay untended for days, their cries echoing through the jungle at night. Marines, though battered, could rely on Navy corpsmen and field hospitals near Henderson, where surgery was performed under lantern light. The imbalance in logistics slowly tipped the scales, even as Japanese soldiers displayed astonishing tenacity in combat. Yet their numbers dwindled and replacements trickled in only through desperate Tokyo Express runs. By November, the Matanikau was less a bastion of strength and more a graveyard for shattered Japanese units. The Marines, scarred but learning, saw in the river's shifting tides a reflection of the campaign itself. Both sides bled, but only one could sustain the cost, and on Guadalcanal that truth became more apparent each week. For the Marines, the Matanikau became synonymous with hardship, but also with camaraderie forged in fire. Men learned to trust squadmates implicitly, for survival often depended on a single lookout or a timely burst of covering fire. Leaders emerged not from rank alone but from calmness under sudden ambush, from the ability to rally men in the chaos of jungle skirmishes. Stories circulated of single gunners holding off entire flanking parties, or of scouts leading patrols back safely after days lost in the wilderness. The river's battles were small in scale but immense in their psychological impact, shaping how men saw the war. Guadalcanal ceased to be an abstract map or a distant strategy. It became a daily test fought at the bend of a river or the edge of a thicket. Victory was measured not in captured towns, but in surviving another patrol without losing half a squad. Yet through this crucible, the Marines hardened into jungle fighters, capable of matching the enemy on his own terms. The Matanikau was not glamorous, but it was essential, and its lessons would echo long after the riverbanks grew quiet. By the end of October 1942, the Matanikau front had stabilized, its clashes fading into the broader struggle for Guadalcanal. The Marines had secured control of the coastal strip, pushing Japanese units back into the interior and denying them easy access to Henderson's perimeter, but the cost had been heavy, the toll measured in fatigue as much as in casualties. Men rotated out of line, haunted by the memory of ambushes and the constant strain of jungle warfare. Japanese survivors withdrew to regroup, their losses hidden but crippling, their morale shaken by repeated failures to dislodge the Marines. Henderson still stood, its runways buzzing with aircraft that owed their existence to the sacrifices made along the river. Commanders recognized that the Matanikau had been more than a series of skirmishes. It had been a training ground where Marines learned how to fight a new kind of war. The experience transformed both tactics and expectations, shaping the remainder of the campaign, and when the island was finally secured months later, veterans would look back and remember the river as the place where they had truly become Guadalcanal Marines. As the struggle for Guadalcanal deepened in the autumn of 1942, the Japanese developed a resupply method, both ingenious and terrifying, known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. Each night, sleek destroyers raced down the slot, the narrow sea channel between the Solomon Islands, delivering men, ammunition, and supplies to embattled forces. The runs were timed to perfection, slipping into Guadalcanal's waters after sunset, and fleeing before daylight brought the threat of Henderson's bombers. These ships traveled at high speed, often more than 30 knots, their black hulls blending into the darkness as jungle silhouettes cloaked their approach. Their decks were packed with troops crammed like sardines, many forced to stand shoulder to shoulder during the overnight sprint. Supplies were carried in barrels, lashed to rails, or rolled overboard near beaches, where swimmers and barges retrieved them at dawn. To Marines on shore, the rumble of engines and distant flashes on the horizon meant reinforcements were arriving for the enemy. To American sailors at sea, the Tokyo Express became a nightly menace, swift and elusive in the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound, and with each run, the balance of the campaign teetered precariously. At the heart of these destroyer runs was a weapon that terrified Allied commanders, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Measuring nearly 30 feet long and powered by compressed oxygen, it was capable of ranges and speeds unmatched by anything in the Allied arsenal. The Long Lance could run over 20 miles at nearly 50 knots, striking with devastating force and leaving little warning of its approach. Japanese crews trained relentlessly in night torpedo doctrine, launching spreads that blanketed entire sections of sea with invisible death. Unlike Allied torpedoes, which often malfunctioned, the Long Lance was brutally reliable, detonating with explosions that could rip cruisers and battleships apart. American captains often did not even see the wakes before their ships erupted in fireballs. Survivors described the horror of steel hulls shuddering, decks lifting under blasts, and compartments flooding within seconds. The weapon became synonymous with Japanese night supremacy, forcing Allied crews to live with the fear that any shadow in the darkness could be their end. The Long Lance was not just a tool of war, it was psychological dominance cast in steel, and it gave the Tokyo Express its deadly sting. The Japanese mastery of night fighting was not an accident, but the result of years of preparation and doctrine. From the 1930s onward, the Imperial Navy had trained rigorously in nocturnal maneuvers, gunnery, and torpedo tactics. Crews drilled under starlight, learning to navigate, signal, and attack in complete darkness with uncanny precision. Destroyers practiced coordinated launches, their torpedoes striking from multiple angles to overwhelm enemy formations. Lookouts were trained to spot silhouettes and muzzle flashes with astonishing acuity, their eyes attuned to shadows and glimmers invisible to less experienced crews. Commanders emphasized aggression, teaching officers that night was not for retreat, but for sudden, overwhelming attack. At Savo Island, and later in numerous clashes, this doctrine reaped deadly results, leaving Allied ships burning before they could even return fire. To American sailors, it felt like fighting ghosts, enemies who appeared from nowhere, struck with precision, and vanished into the night. The Tokyo Express embodied this philosophy, combining speed, stealth, and lethality into a nightly ritual of terror. And for months, it kept Guadalcanal in the balance. American crews, by contrast, entered the campaign with limited experience and inadequate tools for night combat. Radar existed aboard some ships, but few captains trusted it, and operators struggled to interpret ghostly green echoes amid island clutter. Gunnery at night relied heavily on searchlights, which often made Allied ships visible targets long before their salvos found range. Destroyer torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, either failing to detonate or veering wildly off course. Command structures were often muddled, with multiple admirals commanding in the same waters, and coordination breaking down in the heat of sudden contact. Sailors fought bravely, but courage alone could not compensate for tactical inferiority. The contrast between Japanese doctrine and American improvisation could not have been more stark, yet each night battle left lessons etched in fire as survivors analyzed what had gone wrong and what might be corrected. Slowly, painfully, the U.S. Navy began its education in the unforgiving school of the Tokyo Express. And though the tuition was paid in blood, the knowledge would prove decisive in time. The nightly clashes produced some of the most brutal surface engagements of the war, where cruisers and destroyers traded broadsides at point-blank range. Off Cape Esperance in October, American forces ambushed a Japanese convoy, marking one of the first times radar and surprise gave the Allies the upper hand. But such victories were rare in the early months, overshadowed by disasters where long lances tore through U.S. formations. The waters off Guadalcanal became littered with hulks, many slipping beneath the waves with hundreds of sailors still trapped inside. Men described leaping into oil-slicked seas, the surface burning around them as ammunition cooked off in fiery eruptions. Rescue operations at dawn revealed harrowing scenes, lifeboats crowded with ash-covered men, their eyes hollow from shock and exhaustion. Each battle carried the same rhythm, sudden violence, blinding explosions, and silence as survivors drifted amid wreckage. The sea itself seemed cursed, earning the grim title Ironbottom Sound from the number of warships resting beneath its depths. And with each clash, the Tokyo Express left scars not only on ships, but on the men who fought them. For the Marines ashore, the Express meant more than ships and torpedoes. It meant reinforcements for the enemy creeping closer to Henderson Field. Every night the destroyers ran. More Japanese soldiers poured into the jungles, bolstering units that would soon attack ridgelines and perimeters. Marines cursed the rumble of distant engines, knowing it heralded the arrival of fresh adversaries, while they themselves awaited tenuous convoys. Naval gunfire occasionally intercepted the runs, but more often than not the Japanese delivered their cargo and vanished before daylight. Supplies arrived in barrels, bobbing in surf where soldiers swam to retrieve them under fire from Marine patrols. The system was inefficient but effective enough to sustain the Japanese fight. For Marines, each day's battle was a direct consequence of what the night had delivered. The Tokyo Express thus blurred the line between sea and land, its nightly arrivals shaping the tempo of jungle combat. and it became a haunting reminder that Guadalcanal was not isolated but contested on every front. American adaptation, though slow, was relentless, and radar became the spearhead of that change. Crews learned to trust the strange green screens, distinguishing islands from ships and plotting courses in darkness. Destroyer commanders began to use radar to position their ships aggressively, turning night from enemy to ally. Gunnery practices improved, with fire control systems adapted to track echoes rather than silhouettes. Coordination among task groups became tighter, with clearer chains of command imposed after the chaos of early defeats. The Battle of Cape Esperance demonstrated the potential of these changes, as American cruisers surprised a Japanese column and won a rare victory. Later, at the naval battles of Guadalcanal, radar-directed gunfire would prove decisive against even larger Japanese forces. The learning curve was steep, but necessity forced innovation. Each improvement narrowed the gap between Japanese mastery and American resilience, and slowly, the terror of the Tokyo Express began to wane. By November 1942, the Tokyo Express was a double-edged sword, sustaining Japanese forces, but also draining them in unsustainable fashion. Each run consumed destroyers desperately needed elsewhere, wearing down crews and engines with nightly sprints. Supplies delivered were never enough, often limited to a few days of food or a handful of shells, leaving Japanese troops half-starved and undersupplied. The long lance remained deadly, but American radar and tactics were beginning to blunt its advantage. Attrition was taking its toll on both sides, but it was Japan that could least afford the drain. For the Americans, each night battle was another test, another scar, but also another lesson in how to fight and win in the dark. The Tokyo Express, once a symbol of Japanese supremacy, was becoming a symbol of their overextension. Ironbottom Sound held its graveyard of ships as testimony to the price both sides had paid, and through those waters, the tide of naval war was slowly turning. The night no longer belonged solely to Japan. The battle for Guadalcanal was not fought only with rifles, artillery, and warships. It was waged daily against invisible enemies of disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Malaria swept through the ranks like a tide, carried by swarms of mosquitoes rising from stagnant swamps and pools. Dysentery struck with equal cruelty, reducing men to weakness as they struggled to keep fluids in their bodies. Heat and humidity drained energy relentlessly, soaking uniforms with sweat by midday and leaving men staggering with dizziness. Food supplies were always precarious, and Marines learned to stretch rations until meals became ritual rather than sustenance. Exhaustion hollowed their eyes, as sleepless nights under bombardment left nerves raw and tempers short. The enemy in the jungle could be heard or seen. This enemy crept silently into the bloodstream and the gut. By September, commanders estimated that disease claimed as many men from the line as bullets and shells. For many, the hardest battle was not to fight, but simply to remain alive and standing. In Guadalcanal's crucible, survival itself became a form of victory. The Seabees and Marine engineers were the unsung heroes, turning coral, mud, and jungle into lifelines of endurance. At Henderson Field, they labored around the clock to patch bomb craters, roll coral into runways, and build revetments under constant fire. Shell bursts ripped through machinery, yet bulldozers returned to the field at first light, operators steering through smoke and wreckage. Sweat streamed into their eyes as they wrestled with heavy rollers and graders, their rifles propped nearby for sudden firefights. When bombs destroyed fuel dumps, they improvised pits camouflaged with palm fronds, hiding aviation fuel in the very earth. Workshops were little more than open-air sheds, yet mechanics repaired shattered aircraft with scavenged parts stripped from wrecks. Bomb racks were welded from scrap metal, and damaged fuselages patched with sheet steel hammered flat by hand. Every runway repaired, every aircraft kept flying, was a victory against despair and destruction. Without these men, Henderson would have been silenced, and the Marines left blind and exposed. In their work, logistics became as decisive as courage. Medical staff fought their own war in tents, foxholes, and makeshift operating rooms carved from the jungle. Navy corpsmen and Marine medics carried wounded through fire, dragging men from ridgelines and riverbanks to field stations barely shielded from the elements. Surgeons worked by lantern light, their hands slick with blood and sweat as they operated in sweltering humidity. Supplies were scarce, and ether for anesthesia often ran out, forcing operations under morphine alone. Stretchers were improvised from ponchos and bamboo poles, carried by exhausted Marines stumbling over ridges under fire. Disease cases filled beds as quickly as combat wounds, with men writhing from malaria fevers or dysentery-induced dehydration. Nurses and doctors rationed quinine and atabrine tablets like gold, knowing supplies might not last another week. Corpsmen buried comrades by day and returned to surgery by night, their own bodies often fevered and trembling. Death came as often from infection and disease as from shrapnel and bullets. The medical war on Guadalcanal was a daily reminder that the jungle itself was the enemy's ally. Food became both necessity and torment, for rations were meager, monotonous, and frequently spoiled. Marines subsisted on sea rations of hash, beans, and biscuits, supplemented by whatever could be scrounged from abandoned Japanese stores. Rice, tinned fish, and even captured sake found their way into mess lines, though quantities were never enough. Fresh fruit was rare, and vitamin deficiencies left gums bleeding and bodies weakened. Marines joked bitterly about the sameness of meals, but hunger wore down strength and morale alike. Some raided coconut groves for sustenance, risking sniper fire for a mouthful of sweet water and pulp. When transports failed to arrive, portions were cut further, and men fought on with half-filled stomachs. Japanese soldiers fared worse, reduced at times to handfuls of rice or nothing at all, gnawing on roots and leaves to stave off starvation. The struggle for Guadalcanal was as much about calories as about courage, and every meal, or lack of one, decided who could march, fight, or endure another day. Water, too, became a constant problem, as streams and rivers carried parasites and bacteria that poisoned as often as quenched. Marines filled canteens cautiously, boiling water when possible, though fire often gave away positions to prowling snipers. Engineers dug shallow wells and used improvised filtration, but clean sources remained scarce across the perimeter. Dysentery flourished in the heat, spreading rapidly among men who could not afford the luxury of proper sanitation. Bottled water was non-existent, and what little was delivered by sea had to be rationed to frontline units first. Dehydration became a silent killer, felling men before bullets ever touched them. Soldiers spoke of lips cracked to bleeding, of throats too dry to shout warnings during firefights. Every patrol carried more weight in water than in ammunition, yet even that was often insufficient. The jungle tested bodies to their limits with thirst as much as with enemy fire, and the line between strength and collapse was drawn by a single drink. The struggle for logistics reached its climax every time supply convoys were targeted by Japanese bombers or warships. Cargo ships carrying food, medicine, and ammunition were lifelines more precious than any battleship. Marines onshore watched anxiously as transports tried to unload, knowing every crate brought survival closer. When raids forced convoys to flee, men cursed bitterly, for it meant another week of hunger, shortages, and improvisation. At Henderson, pilots flew not just combat sorties but supply drops, stuffing aircraft with food tins and medical packs. Coast watchers and local islanders carried supplies through jungle trails, risking discovery to deliver rice and quinine. The battle for Guadalcanal was therefore not only an American effort, but a multinational web of support woven by desperate necessity. Without supply, Henderson would have been an airstrip without planes, the Marines' defenders without bullets. Commanders understood this truth, and gambled fleets in the effort to deliver convoys. Victory was measured as much in tonnage landed as in ground gained. Disease and hunger spared no one, breaking even the strongest men and officers. Malaria left veterans shivering with fevers, their bodies drenched in sweat while their minds clouded with delirium. Dysentery reduced fighters to shells of themselves, staggering into foxholes too weak to lift rifles. Commanders rotated men as best they could, but there were no reserves untouched by illness. By late October, reports suggested that nearly 2/3 of the Marines were unfit for duty at any given time. Yet units held lines, patrolled rivers, and launched attacks despite their physical collapse. Soldiers joked grimly that they were fighting malaria with bullets, but the truth was darker. The hidden enemy was claiming more than the Japanese could with rifles and mortars. Every firefight was fought by men already half broken, pushing past weakness into sheer will. And in that endurance lay the essence of the Guadalcanal struggle. In the end, Guadalcanal's outcome hinged not just on bravery, but on the quiet, grinding machinery of logistics and medicine. Henderson Field survived because engineers patched runways, mechanics rebuilt planes, and corpsmen dragged the wounded from fire. Marines endured because rice arrived in tins, quinine in crates, and fuel in barrels ferried across hostile seas. Victory came not only from the roar of wildcats or the crash of artillery, but from the daily triumph over hunger, thirst, and disease. The campaign was as much about supply lines as about front lines, a truth often invisible to those far from the battlefield. Yet for the men who lived it, the memory of hunger pangs, fever sweats, and thirst was as vivid as the memory of gunfire. Guadalcanal proved that wars are not won by battles alone, but by sustaining men through the battles. Every crate unloaded, every wound treated, every runway patched became part of the struggle for survival. And in that struggle, the hidden enemy of disease and hunger left scars no less enduring than bullets. The road to victory ran through supply, and without it, Guadalcanal could never have been held. At the heart of the Guadalcanal campaign lay not only the courage of infantrymen, but the weight of decisions made by commanders, balancing risk and survival. On the ground, Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift embodied stoicism, leading the 1st Marine Division with calm pragmatism amid relentless pressure. His men fought in mud, heat, and terror, yet Vandegrift kept discipline intact, projecting steadiness even when food, ammunition, and reinforcements ran dangerously low. He lived close to his troops, sharing their hardships in foxholes and under bombardment, a presence that inspired confidence amid chaos. Offshore, however, leadership at sea was fractured by conflicting priorities, logistical constraints, and the constant terror of Japanese naval power. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the carriers that provided critical cover for the landings, but his caution soon drew criticism from Marines ashore. Fletcher feared losing his carriers, the only shield against Japanese reinforcements, and withdrew them after just 48 hours of support. His decision left Vandegrift's Marines isolated, feeding bitterness between sea and shore commands. The tension revealed a truth. Leadership on Guadalcanal was a mosaic of personalities, each decision rippling down to men in the mud, and the weight of those personalities would shape the entire campaign. Vandegrift's greatest strength was his ability to project quiet confidence, even as his situation bordered on hopeless. His Marines were green, underfed, and racked with disease, yet he instilled in them the belief that they could hold Henderson Field against any assault. Each night, when artillery thundered and enemy bombers strafed, Vandegrift circulated among foxholes, speaking directly to privates and corporals. His measured voice and presence reminded his men that they were not forgotten, that their suffering had purpose. Unlike many commanders of his generation, Vandegrift resisted theatrics or rash promises. His authority lay in consistency. He balanced discipline with empathy, recognizing the psychological strain of disease and hunger alongside combat. In reports to Washington, he remained frank, neither exaggerating victories nor minimizing losses. His honesty built credibility, ensuring that reinforcements and supplies eventually arrived despite the Navy's fears. Marines revered him not as a distant general, but as one of their own, a man who shared the dangers of Guadalcanal with them. And in that bond of trust, the 1st Marine Division found its backbone. Admiral Fletcher, by contrast, represented the cold arithmetic of naval strategy, a calculus Marines found difficult to accept. Commanding 3 carriers, he knew that their loss would cripple the Pacific Fleet and leave the entire theater vulnerable. At the same time, he was tasked with covering the landings, a mission inherently at odds with his cautious temperament. When Japanese bombers struck hard in the opening days, Fletcher judged that his fuel and air losses justified withdrawal. To Marines digging foxholes under fire, his decision looked like abandonment, a betrayal at the very hour they needed support most. Fletcher's critics painted him as timid, but in truth he bore the burden of balancing irreplaceable carriers against a land campaign just beginning. His decisions revealed the limits of Allied resources in 1942, when every loss carried disproportionate weight. History judged him harshly, yet his caution reflected the fragile state of America's naval strength. On Guadalcanal, his absence deepened the isolation felt by the men ashore, and that absence became a symbol of the chasm between sea and land commands. Overseeing the campaign from Noumea in New Caledonia was Vice Admiral Robert L. Ghormley, whose leadership soon came under scrutiny. Ghormley was a capable administrator, but his personality was cautious, hesitant, and ill-suited to the fluid demands of the Guadalcanal struggle. From his headquarters far removed from the fighting, he often seemed detached, issuing cautious orders while failing to inspire confidence in subordinates. Communications with Vandegrift and task force commanders were slow, muddled, and frequently pessimistic. He doubted the ability to hold Guadalcanal and frequently considered withdrawal, a perspective that filtered down as gloom to those fighting. Reports from Henderson Field were filled with determination, yet Ghormley's tone suggested defeat was inevitable. Officers described him as tired, depressed, and reluctant to visit the front to grasp its realities. In a campaign that demanded aggressive energy, his reserve became a liability. Washington, recognizing the problem, decided by October that change was needed. And that change came in the form of a man whose energy was the opposite of Ghormley's. On October 18, 1942, Admiral William F. Halsey assumed command of the South Pacific, electrifying the theater with his presence. Halsey was brash, direct, and radiated confidence in a way that instantly raised morale among sailors and Marines alike. Known as Bull, he spoke in plain language, promising to support Guadalcanal with everything at his disposal. Unlike Ghormley, he made personal visits to the front, standing among Marines at Henderson Field, shaking hands and listening to their struggles. His presence reassured them that they were no longer alone, that higher command was invested in their survival. At sea, Halsey drove his task forces aggressively, throwing every ship and plane into the fight, regardless of the risks. His style carried dangers, but it also matched the desperate stakes of the Guadalcanal campaign. Men responded to his energy, believing that with Halsey in command, the tide might truly turn. His arrival marked a shift in tone and tempo, from hesitant defense to aggressive determination, and that shift rippled outward into every decision made thereafter. The interplay of personalities, Vandegrift's steadiness, Fletcher's caution, Ghormley's pessimism, and Halsey's boldness, defined the rhythm of Guadalcanal. Where Vandegrift inspired from the ground, Fletcher calculated from the horizon. His decisions felt in absence rather than presence. Ghormley's distance contrasted sharply with Halsey's immediacy, the latter galvanizing troops by showing his face at Henderson's battered runway. These differences created friction, but also revealed the multidimensional demands of the campaign. Ground commanders begged for supplies and fire support, while naval commanders weighed each sortie against the threat of Japanese battleships. Each man operated within his own constraints, yet their choices collided in ways that shaped the lives of ordinary soldiers and sailors. The Marines could not eat without convoys, convoys could not sail without carriers, carriers could not risk exposure without command approval. The chain of survival was fragile, and its links were forged in personalities as much as in steel. In Guadalcanal's crucible, leadership was not abstract but immediate, its weight measured in blood and endurance, and the balance of the campaign hinged on how those leaders bore that weight. For the men on the front lines, these command decisions were not distant abstractions, they were lived realities. When carriers withdrew, it meant bombers overhead, and no fighter cover to meet them. When convoys delayed, it meant hunger, fever, and thinning ammunition. When commanders visited the lines, it meant reassurance that their sacrifices mattered. Marines spoke of Vandegrift as a father figure, whose presence steadied their hands on rifles. Sailors cheered Halsey's blunt messages, promising to hit the enemy harder than he hit them. Even Fletcher, criticized bitterly ashore, was recognized later for safeguarding carriers that would become decisive in the larger Pacific War. Ghormley's gloom, though, lingered in memory as a shadow, a reminder of how uncertainty at the top could sap strength below. The interconnectedness of leadership and frontline endurance was undeniable, and Guadalcanal proved that wars are fought as much in the minds of commanders as in the mud of foxholes. By November 1942, the leadership mosaic had hardened into a chain of resolve that pointed toward eventual victory. Vandegrift's Marines held their perimeter with tenacity born of trust in their general. Fletcher's carriers, though withdrawn, preserved striking power for the battles yet to come. Ghormley had departed, his caution replaced by Halsey's firebrand determination that galvanized the theatre. Together, these figures represented the shifting phases of Guadalcanal: uncertainty, endurance, and finally aggressive momentum. Each personality left its imprint on the campaign, shaping morale, strategy, and the rhythm of combat. Their clashes and contrasts revealed the complexity of joint warfare, where land and sea could never be separated. For the Allies, the eventual balance struck between caution and boldness proved decisive, and for the men who fought under their command, the memory of those leaders would forever frame the story of Guadalcanal. Leadership, in all its flawed humanity, had carried the burden of a desperate campaign, and in the crucible of Guadalcanal, it had been tested to the limit. By October 1942, the seas around Guadalcanal had become a nightly arena of steel, fire, and sudden death. The Japanese Tokyo Express continued its high-speed runs, and each convoy threatened to deliver fresh troops to assault Henderson Field. American commanders knew that only by challenging the enemy at sea could the fragile foothold on the island be preserved. Radar, once mistrusted, was now integrated into night tactics, offering a fragile edge against Japan's mastery of nocturnal warfare. On October 11th, 12, this shift was tested in the Battle of Cape Esperance, when American cruisers and destroyers intercepted a Japanese force near the northwest corner of Guadalcanal. Under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the U.S. task group opened fire with surprising effectiveness, catching the Japanese in a rare moment of vulnerability. Shells slammed into enemy cruisers and destroyers, sinking several and forcing the rest to retreat. For the first time, American crews felt that the night might no longer belong exclusively to Japan. Yet even in victory, losses and confusion revealed how much still had to be learned. Cape Esperance proved that radar-directed gunnery could shift the balance, but it also highlighted the perils of miscommunication. American ships fired on one another in the darkness, mistaking friend for foe amid the chaos of flashing guns and radio static. Crews fought with bravery, but coordination remained brittle, and chance still dictated much of the outcome. The Japanese, though bloodied, quickly regrouped and resumed their nightly runs, undeterred by a single setback. Marines ashore celebrated the victory, knowing that fewer enemy troops would reach their lines, but they understood it was only a temporary reprieve. The Tokyo Express would return, and with it the threat of another desperate assault on Henderson Field. Cape Esperance was a step forward in the U.S. Navy's painful education in night fighting, but it was only the beginning of a harsher test to come. The lessons learned, trust in radar, aggression in maneuver, and the importance of coordinated command would be vital in November. For soon the greatest sea battles of Guadalcanal would erupt in nights of unprecedented violence, and those nights would decide the fate of the campaign itself. In early November, Japanese High Command resolved to mount a decisive effort to retake Guadalcanal, sending transports laden with troops under the cover of powerful escort forces. The stakes could not have been higher, for Tokyo saw Henderson Field as the hinge of the entire Solomons campaign. To protect their convoys, Japanese admirals dispatched battleships to shell the airfield by night, planning to annihilate aircraft on the ground before landing reinforcements at dawn. On November 12th, U.S. convoys carrying reinforcements and supplies clashed with Japanese forces in the waters north of Guadalcanal. The result was a brutal night action on November 13th, later known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. American cruisers and destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, stumbled into Japanese battleships He and Kirishima in near point-blank range. What followed was a melee more like a brawl than a naval engagement, with ships colliding, torpedoes ripping through hulls, and salvos fired at ranges measured in yards. The darkness was lit by flames and tracers as both sides suffered devastating losses. It was a night of chaos, confusion, and ferocious courage, and it reshaped the war in Ironbottom Sound. The cost of the November 13th battle was staggering, a bloody testament to the ferocity of close-quarters naval combat. Admiral Callahan and Admiral Scott were both killed on their bridges, along with hundreds of sailors trapped in burning compartments. American destroyers and cruisers were torn apart by long-lance torpedoes, their decks erupting as magazines detonated. Yet the Japanese paid dearly as well, with the battleship Hay crippled, her engines wrecked by shellfire, and her decks aflame. Unable to escape, she was hammered by repeated airstrikes the next day, finally sinking beneath the waves. For the first time, Japanese battleships had been checked in their effort to crush Henderson Field. The sacrifice of American sailors had bought Henderson another reprieve, ensuring that the Cactus Air Force could continue to fly. Survivors described the night as a nightmare of fire and steel, where the sea itself seemed to ignite around them. Ironbottom Sound earned its name again, its floor littered with fresh wrecks, and the campaign surged into its deadliest phase. Just 2 nights later, on November 14th, the the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal erupted with equal ferocity. This time, the Japanese committed the battleship Kirishima, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, determined to finish the job of bombarding Henderson. Waiting for them were American battleships, Washington and South Dakota, commanded by Admiral Willis Lee. Radar-directed fire gave the Americans an edge, and Washington's massive 16-inch guns opened up with devastating accuracy in the darkness. Shell after shell tore into Kirishima, her hull shattered and burning until she capsized and sank. Yet victory came at cost, as South Dakota was battered by Japanese cruisers, suffering heavy damage and dozens of casualties. The night battle was a clash of titans, steel leviathans, trading blows at point-blank range in black waters. For the Japanese, the loss of Kirishima marked the failure of their effort to dominate Guadalcanal by surface power. For the Americans, it was proof that radar and determination could triumph even against Japan's most formidable weapons, and the balance of naval warfare in the Solomons began to shift irrevocably. While the great battles drew headlines, the supporting clashes of early November revealed the relentless grind of the campaign. American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese forces in the Battle of Tassafaronga, suffering heavy losses despite numerical advantage. Long-lance torpedoes again proved devastating, sending multiple U.S. cruisers to the bottom in minutes. Survivors recalled the eerie silence of ships breaking apart in the night, the screams of trapped sailors mingling with the roar of fire. Japanese destroyers escaped with minimal damage, demonstrating that even as the tide turned, their night tactics remained deadly. Yet the Japanese victory at Tassafaronga was hollow, for their supplies reached Guadalcanal in pitiful quantities. Reinforcements landed starving and undersupplied, unable to sustain the tempo of operations against Henderson Field. The Americans absorbed the losses, repaired their ships, and pressed on with growing confidence. The tactical lessons were harsh but invaluable, reminding commanders that overconfidence could still be punished. And through those bitter defeats, the U.S. Navy refined the doctrines that would carry it to victory. For sailors, these battles were not abstract maneuvers, but nights of unimaginable terror and sacrifice. Men fought fires with bare hands, carried wounded through flooded compartments, and clung to debris as their ships slipped beneath the waves. Oil fires turned the sea into an inferno, trapping swimmers who leapt overboard to escape explosions. Darkness magnified fear, with every flash revealing both friend and foe in a blur of violence. Commanders gave orders in seconds that sealed the fate of hundreds, their decisions shaping survival or death. Survivors remembered the smell of burning flesh, the shock of cold water, and the haunting silence after ships vanished. The cost of these clashes was counted in lives as much as in tonnage, in memories that sailors carried long after the war. The human toll etched Ironbottom Sound into history as one of the most haunted battlefields of the Pacific. And it reminded both navies that control of the sea was never cheap. Each night's victory was purchased dearly, in courage, chaos, and blood. By the end of November 1942, the naval struggle for Guadalcanal had reached its decisive turning point. The Japanese had thrown in battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, only to see them shattered in ferocious night engagements. Their attempts to annihilate Henderson Field by bombardment had failed, and their convoys arrived in tatters, undersupplied, and half-starved. The Americans, though bloodied and battered, had learned the lessons of radar, coordination, and resilience. Each battle sharpened their ability to fight at night, turning weakness into strength through hard-won experience. For Tokyo, the losses of battleships, cruisers, and veteran crews marked a hemorrhage of power that could not be replenished quickly. For Washington, the survival of Guadalcanal justified the terrible sacrifices, proving that perseverance could outlast even Japan's fiercest blows. The sea campaign had cost thousands of lives, but it secured the fragile lifeline to Henderson Field. And from that lifeline, the balance of the Pacific War began to tilt. Guadalcanal was no longer just a foothold, it was becoming the pivot of victory. On the night of November 30th, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal once again erupted into violence, this time in the clash known as the Battle of Tassafaronga. The Japanese, determined to sustain their starving troops ashore, dispatched 8 destroyers loaded with supplies, barrels lashed to decks, and ready to be rolled into the sea. Opposing them was a powerful American force under Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, composed of 5 cruisers and 4 destroyers. With radar advantage and numerical superiority, the Americans sought to intercept and annihilate yet another Tokyo Express run. At first, the plan unfolded with textbook precision as American cruisers detected enemy movements and maneuvered into ambush. As the Japanese approached, unaware they had been spotted, Wright's ships unleashed a sudden storm of gunfire. The lead Japanese destroyer, Takanami, was quickly illuminated and pummeled, exploding in a brilliant fireball that lit the night sky. For a moment the battle seemed to tilt decisively in favor of the Americans. But beneath the surface, a more deadly Japanese weapon was already streaking silently toward them, and within minutes the triumph would dissolve into disaster. The Japanese destroyers, though outgunned, responded with extraordinary discipline and training, launching spreads of their formidable Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes. Each vessel fired in practice sequence, releasing dozens of torpedoes into the black waters with uncanny precision. These weapons, fueled by compressed oxygen, left no telltale wake and traveled at speeds up to 50 knots. American lookouts saw nothing, and radar offered no warning of what was already racing beneath the surface. Minutes after the Takanami's destruction, the first torpedo struck the cruiser Minneapolis, tearing open her bow and engulfing the deck in flames. Seconds later, torpedoes slammed into New Orleans, severing her bow completely and sending twisted steel plunging into the sea. Pensacola was next, struck amidships, her compartments flooding as fires spread across decks. Northampton suffered a mortal blow, struck twice, her hull breaking open before she rolled and sank beneath the waves. In less than half an hour, 4 American cruisers were crippled or destroyed, a stunning reversal born from invisible Menace, and the Long Lance had once again proven its mastery of night seas. The chaos of Tassafaronga exposed the vulnerability of American doctrine against Japanese night fighting. Admiral Wright's force had numerical superiority, radar advantage, and the initiative, yet they had underestimated the torpedo threat. Radar had revealed enemy ships, but doctrine still emphasized gunnery over maneuver, and cruisers closed range rather than dispersing to avoid counterattack. Japanese destroyer crews, trained to launch torpedoes in rapid spreads, exploited this hesitation ruthlessly. The results were catastrophic. 1 Japanese destroyer lost against 4 American cruisers, crippled or sunk. Survivors recalled the shock of seeing their ships torn apart in seconds, flames illuminating faces streaked with sweat and oil. Engineers fought to keep turbines running, while damage control crews battled flooding with pumps and sandbags. Men scrambled across burning decks, dragging wounded comrades to lifeboats as ammunition detonated around them. For many, the sea became both grave and refuge, swallowing ships and carrying survivors clinging to debris. Tassafaronga was not simply another battle, it was a harsh reminder that doctrine and technology could decide survival as much as courage. And America's naval learning curve was far from complete. The loss at Tassafaronga forced a reckoning within the US Navy, which now faced the undeniable superiority of Japanese torpedo doctrine. Reports highlighted the lethality of the Long Lance, its range and reliability eclipsing American torpedoes plagued with duds and misfires. Naval engineers and tacticians studied wreckage and survivor accounts, realizing that ships had sailed into battles unaware of the full threat beneath the waves. Radar, though valuable, could not detect torpedoes, leaving American cruisers blind to the deadliest weapon in the enemy arsenal. Commanders recognized that concentration of firepower meant concentration of risk, and doctrine began to shift toward dispersed formations at night. Destroyers were tasked more aggressively with screening roles, rushing to intercept enemy launches and using their own torpedoes preemptively. Gunnery remained vital, but torpedo defense became an equal priority. The lessons of Tassafaronga were bitter, but they began to reshape American night tactics in the Pacific. And though ships lay at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound, the knowledge gained would echo in future victories. In failure, adaptation was born. For Japanese sailors, Tassafaronga became a celebrated triumph, proof that discipline and training could overcome superior numbers. Survivors of the Takanami mourned their comrades, but they knew their sacrifice had brought a stunning reversal. The success emboldened Tokyo, reinforcing faith in the destroyer force as the sharp edge of night warfare. Yet the victory was hollow in strategic terms, for supplies once again failed to reach Guadalcanal in meaningful quantity. Barrels thrown overboard were scattered or destroyed, and starving soldiers ashore received little relief from the effort. Japanese command celebrated the battle but faced the grim truth that tactical brilliance could not overcome logistical starvation. Their destroyer crews remained lethal, but every sortie drained resources, fuel, and irreplaceable veterans. The triumph at Tassafaronga masked the steady erosion of Japan's ability to sustain the campaign, and while the Long Lance terror remained real, its advantage would diminish as the Americans adapted. The battle thus marked both the height of Japanese torpedo supremacy and the beginning of its decline. For American sailors who survived, the memory of Tassafaronga was etched in fire and steel. Men recalled the thunderous roar of explosions, the searing heat of flames, and the sickening tilt of decks as ships began to founder. Corpsmen worked by flashlight amid smoke, bandaging wounds and carrying the injured to lifeboats as bulkheads collapsed around them. Survivors floated for hours in oil-slicked water, clinging to debris as sharks circled and rescue ships searched by flare light. The sea, already littered with wrecks from earlier battles, claimed more victims that night, earning its grim title of Ironbottom Sound anew. Officers spoke of the helplessness of watching proud cruisers gutted in minutes, their crews fighting valiantly but powerless against unseen weapons. For many, Tassafaronga became a ghost they carried long after the war, a night when confidence turned to ruin in the span of moments. And yet, from that ruin, resolve hardened. America would not retreat from the lessons bought with so much blood, and sailors vowed that the night seas would one day belong to them. Technological adaptation accelerated after Tassafaronga, as radar became not just a tool for detection, but the core of new doctrine. Destroyer squadrons trained to use radar-guided gunfire and torpedoes aggressively, turning the tables on Japanese night tactics. Commanders emphasized surprise, speed, and coordinated strikes, ensuring that cruisers would no longer sail blindly into torpedo spreads. New torpedoes were developed, though reliability remained a struggle until later in the war. More importantly, the U.S. Navy internalized the need to respect the Long Lance and never underestimate Japanese destroyers again. Simulations, wargames, and field exercises drilled these lessons into crews preparing for the next battles. Radar officers gained influence, their role elevated from curiosity to central command advisors. The navy that had bled at Tassafaronga was not the same Navy that would fight in 1943 and beyond. The pain of that night forced an evolution that no classroom could have taught, and it ensured that American sailors would meet their enemy on more equal terms in the future. By the end of 1942, the Battle of Tassafaronga stood as both tragedy and turning point. For the Japanese, it was the last great flourish of torpedo supremacy, a testament to skill but a failure in strategic impact. For the Americans, it was a humiliating defeat, yet one that accelerated the transformation of doctrine, technology, and training. Ironbottom Sound claimed more wrecks, but each ship lost carried with it a lesson etched in steel and sacrifice. From this crucible, the US Navy emerged harder, sharper, and more willing to embrace innovation. Radar would grow in power, destroyer tactics would evolve, and the torpedo menace would eventually be met with equal ferocity. Tassafaronga was not the end of the struggle, but the midpoint of a deadly education. And though the night belonged to the Japanese that evening, dawn brought with it a shifting tide. The cost was terrible, but the lessons were permanent, and in the balance of war, knowledge was often the truest weapon. By December 1942, the rhythm of Guadalcanal was no longer defined solely by desperation, but by the slow, steady arrival of reinforcements. Fresh battalions of Marines disembarked on battered beaches, their uniforms crisp compared to the ragged veterans who greeted them. Army units followed, bringing new faces, fresh energy, and a sense that the long months of isolation were ending. Supply ships once hunted mercilessly now reached the island with greater frequency, their holds filled with food, ammunition, and medical stores. Henderson Field, once patched daily under bombardment, now buzzed with increasing numbers of aircraft fueled by steady deliveries. The balance was fragile but unmistakable. The Allies were beginning to control the tempo rather than merely react. The Marines, who had endured hunger and disease, watched in disbelief as fresh rations and cigarettes arrived in bulk. Trucks and jeeps appeared on trails once navigated only by weary men on foot. For the first time, Guadalcanal felt less like a desperate foothold and more like the base of a growing offensive, and that shift marked the beginning of the campaign's next phase. The arrival of the U.S. Army's American Division and the 25th Infantry Division transformed the balance of manpower on the island. These units, though inexperienced in jungle warfare, were well equipped and eager to prove themselves in combat. They brought with them heavy artillery, fresh mortars, and the logistical backbone needed to support extended operations. Veterans of the 1st Marine Division, haggard from months of fighting, now rotated to the rear, their place taken by soldiers who would carry the fight forward. The Marines had endured the crucible of defense. The Army would shoulder much of the burden of the offensive. Integration was not always smooth. Differences in training and culture produced friction, but necessity forged cooperation. Officers coordinated operations with growing precision, blending Marine tenacity with Army firepower. The Japanese, meanwhile, found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outgunned, their reinforcements arriving in dwindling numbers through a shrinking Tokyo Express. Each passing week tilted the scales further in Allied favor, and the men on Guadalcanal began to sense that survival was giving way to the possibility of victory. Air superiority played a decisive role in this transformation. As the Cactus Air Force matured into a formidable shield and sword, reinforcements brought more Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and B-17 set, filling Henderson's coral runways with aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip. Pilots who once flew in ones and twos now scrambled in coordinated groups, intercepting bombers before they reached the island. Supply convoys benefited from layered protection, reducing losses and enabling the buildup of ammunition and fuel stockpiles. Reconnaissance flights tracked Japanese shipping along the slot, guiding naval task forces to ambush convoys before they could approach. Airstrikes extended beyond Guadalcanal, hitting enemy bases on New Georgia and even Rabaul, blunting the reach of Japanese aviation. Mechanics, once improvising with scrap, now had the tools and spare parts to keep aircraft in the air consistently. Morale soared as the skies, once ruled by Japanese Zeros, increasingly belonged to American pilots. Every sortie carried the promise not just of survival but of dominance, and from Henderson's buzzing runways, the island's fate was slowly secured. Naval superiority, too, shifted as reinforcements arrived and American doctrine matured. Radar-directed gunfire became the standard, reducing the terror of night battles that had once favored the Japanese. Destroyer squadrons learned to screen aggressively, intercepting Tokyo Express runs before they could approach the beaches. New ships joined the fleet, replacing those lost in the bloody clashes of November, and the confidence of commanders grew with each engagement. Supply convoys that once seemed doomed now arrived under heavier escort, their cargoes unloading steadily onto the beaches. The Japanese Navy, weakened by attrition and the loss of veteran crews, found its reach increasingly limited. Each failed attempt to bombard Henderson drained fuel, ships, and morale. Ironbottom Sound, once a graveyard of American hopes, became instead a symbol of Japanese overextension. With every passing week, the sea lanes tilted toward Allied control, and the men on Guadalcanal knew that their lifeline was no longer fragile but strengthening. On the ground, this shift manifested in the first deliberate Allied offensives beyond the perimeter. Army units launched probing attacks along the Matanikau, discovering that Japanese resistance was weakening under the weight of hunger and supply collapse. Patrols encountered fewer well-supplied enemy soldiers and more emaciated survivors, their uniforms tattered and rifles rusted from jungle damp. Mortar barrages and artillery bombardments prepared advances, scattering Japanese defenders who once struck fear with sudden ambushes. Tanks, scarce but valuable, supported infantry pushes, crushing bunkers and strongpoints that had held up Marines months before. The psychological shift was unmistakable. No longer did Allied forces fight merely to repel assaults, but to seize ground and dictate terms. Each ridge captured, each river crossed, carried the campaign deeper into Japanese-held territory. Soldiers spoke of the strange feeling of momentum after so many months of standing on the defensive. For the Japanese, these offensives signaled a grim truth: the tide was turning irreversibly, and on Guadalcanal, that tide was measured in blood, terrain, and will. The human element of reinforcement was just as significant as the material. Fresh troops carried with them a different energy, though it sometimes clashed with the haunted expressions of veterans. Marines, thin from malaria and hunger, looked at the newcomers with a mixture of relief and envy. Relief that the burden was being shared, envy at their unspoiled strength and clean uniforms. Jokes flew in camp, but behind the humor lay the quiet pride of men who had endured what the new arrivals could not yet imagine. Veterans guided green soldiers through jungle trails, teaching them how to move silently, how to read terrain, how to tell friend from foe in the shadows. Corpsmen passed along grim lessons about malaria pills and water purification, habits that meant the difference between life and death. The bond between Marine and Army deepened in shared foxholes and joint patrols, forged under fire rather than on parade grounds. Reinforcements did not just bring strength, they brought renewal, and in that renewal lay the foundation for the final push. For the Japanese, the growing Allied strength spelled a slow but certain doom. Their troops dug into ridges and strongpoints, but starvation gnawed at their resolve and ammunition shortages crippled their defense. Supplies that reached shore were meager, often too little to sustain even basic operations. Soldiers grew gaunt, their strength fading even as orders demanded renewed attacks against fortified positions. Medical supplies were non-existent, and disease claimed more men than American bullets. Commanders watched their regiments wither, unable to replace losses or sustain momentum. Morale plummeted as rumors spread that Tokyo could not deliver decisive reinforcements. Each Allied offensive chipped away at positions once thought secure, leaving Japanese survivors retreating deeper into the jungle. The initiative had shifted decisively, and Japanese strategy devolved into desperate attempts to delay the inevitable. Guadalcanal was slipping from their grasp, ridge by ridge, river by river. By January 1943, Guadalcanal was no longer a question of survival, but of victory. Reinforcements had given Vandegrift and his successors the strength to think offensively, to envision the final expulsion of Japanese forces from the island. The Cactus Air Force dominated the skies, supply convoys landed with increasing confidence, and coordinated offensives pressed relentlessly westward. Soldiers who once clung to foxholes now advanced in formation, backed by artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The jungle still killed, disease still claimed lives, but the balance was unmistakable. The Japanese clung to shrinking pockets of resistance, fighting with courage, but no longer with advantage. The campaign had shifted from one of endurance to one of inevitability. Guadalcanal, once a desperate gamble, was becoming an Allied stronghold, and in that transformation lay the turning point of the Pacific War. As 1943 opened on Guadalcanal, the campaign shifted from holding a fragile perimeter to driving Japanese forces from their jungle strongholds. The interior of the island was a labyrinth of ridges, ravines, and thick canopy that swallowed men whole and made every advance a grinding ordeal. Japanese defenders dug deep into coral hillsides, carving bunkers and spider holes that blended seamlessly into the terrain. Marines and soldiers advancing uphill often faced fire from positions invisible until they were only yards away. Every ridge captured revealed another behind it, each bristling with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. Patrols crept through dense undergrowth, where visibility dropped to a few feet, ambushes exploding without warning in deafening bursts of gunfire. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards, every step paid for in sweat, blood, and nerves frayed to the breaking point. The campaign was no longer about quick assaults but about attrition, grinding the enemy down ridge by ridge, and in that crucible, the jungle itself became the fiercest ally of the defenders. Mount Austin loomed as the first great test, its slopes covered in thick jungle and its ridges honeycombed with Japanese defenses. Atop its heights sat the Gifu, a fortified position bristling with bunkers, machine guns, and artillery pieces that commanded approaches to Henderson Field. Army units, including the 25th Division, were tasked with dislodging the defenders, a mission that soon revealed the cost of jungle combat. Attacks were met with crossfire from cleverly hidden positions, leaving advancing troops pinned in open ground. Artillery and mortars hammered the slopes, but Japanese bunkers built of logs and earth absorbed incredible punishment. Infantry had to close in with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets, clearing each position by hand. The enemy fought to the last man, refusing surrender even when hopelessly outnumbered. Every gain was soaked in blood, every bunker cleared at the price of multiple lives. Survivors spoke of climbing through smoke, roots, and corpses, unsure if the next tree concealed a sniper or a comrade. Mount Austin became a symbol of the brutal inch-by-inch nature of the interior fight, and its capture showed that victory would come only through sheer endurance. Japanese tactics relied heavily on night infiltration and sudden banzai charges, designed to shock and overwhelm weary defenders. Under cover of darkness, squads crept through the jungle, cutting phone lines, infiltrating foxholes, and sometimes bayoneting sleeping soldiers. When full charges came, they erupted in terrifying cries, waves of infantry rushing headlong into machine guns and rifles. Marines and army troops held firm, firing until barrels glowed red, mowing down attackers who often fought until they were cut to pieces. Survivors described the horror of fighting enemies who leapt into foxholes with bayonets, grappling in hand-to-hand combat in pitch blackness. Flamethrowers and grenades became essential tools, searing bunkers and breaking charges before they could gain momentum. Yet for every charge repelled, the cost was heavy, nerves stretched taut by the unrelenting strain of night battle. The banzai was not merely a tactic, but a manifestation of the Japanese warrior ethos, demanding sacrifice even when victory was impossible. For defenders, it was both terrifying and exhausting, a reminder that the jungle never truly slept, and in those desperate nights, courage was measured in the simple act of holding ground. Terrain dictated every tactic, shaping how men fought and how they died. Coral ridges offered the Japanese commanding views, forcing attackers to advance uphill into interlocking fire. Ravines, filled with bamboo and ferns, provided cover for ambushes that shattered patrols with sudden bursts of rifle and machine gun fire. Muddy trails became killing zones where mortars bracketed columns and snipers picked off leaders. For Americans, artillery was both blessing and curse, devastating when it struck accurately, but often unable to penetrate bunkers buried under roots and stone. Infantrymen relied on mortars, bazookas, and flamethrowers carried laboriously through choking terrain. Communication was tenuous, radio signals lost in the canopy, and runners cut down by hidden fire. Casualty evacuation was agonizing. Wounded men carried on stretchers for miles through jungle mud under constant threat of ambush. Disease and exhaustion compounded the attrition, leaving units hollowed out even after successful attacks. The jungle gave defenders every advantage and attackers every hardship, and through that harsh calculus, the campaign became a war of attrition more than maneuver. The Japanese defenders were gaunt, hungry, and increasingly desperate, yet their discipline held even as supplies dwindled. Starvation gnawed at their strength, leaving them weak, but their will to resist remained undiminished. Soldiers fought from bunkers until grenades rolled inside, refusing surrender even in hopeless situations. Ammunition shortages forced some to rely on bayonets, swords, and even makeshift weapons, charging into certain death rather than abandoning their posts. For Americans, this ferocity created a paradox. The enemy was weakened by hunger, yet no less lethal when cornered. Banzai charges grew more frequent as supply collapsed, acts of desperation as much as strategy. The psychological toll was immense, for defenders never knew if a night would bring silence or a sudden eruption of suicidal fury. Every ridge taken came with stories of last stands, of Japanese soldiers dying in foxholes clutching grenades to their chests. To Marines and soldiers, the enemy seemed both pitiful and terrifying, a contradiction that defined the Guadalcanal campaign, and the attrition wore down both sides, leaving the jungle littered with unburied dead. American adaptation was gradual but relentless, shaped by blood and necessity. Squads learned to advance in bounding movements, one covering while the other crept forward under fire. Flamethrowers and demolition charges became the primary tools for clearing bunkers, supported by close-in mortar fire. Patrols grew more cautious, moving with scouts and flankers rather than single-file columns. Airstrikes were called in on ridgelines, though dense canopy often limited their effectiveness, forcing infantry to finish what bombs could not. Artillery coordination improved, with forward observers braving enemy fire to direct barrages more precisely. Combined arms became the rhythm of jungle war. Riflemen, machine gunners, mortarmen and flamethrower teams, working as a single organism. Casualties still mounted, but advances became more deliberate and less costly than early attacks. Each success fed into a growing sense that the Japanese could be forced back, bunker by bunker, ridge by ridge. The slow grind of adaptation transformed desperation into a methodical campaign, and in that transformation lay the seeds of ultimate victory. For the men fighting these battles, the experience was a descent into a world where death was constant and mercy rare. Soldiers spoke of advancing past the bodies of comrades who had fallen days before, already decayed in the humid air. The jungle smelled of rot and cordite, a stench that clung to uniforms and refused to wash away. Wounded men cried out for water as stretcher teams stumbled through mud, their path lit only by muzzle flashes and flares. Corpsmen worked without pause, bandaging wounds by flashlight, praying for evacuation that might not come. Nights were haunted by the sounds of the enemy, whispers, cries, and sudden gunfire that turned rest into illusion. Veterans emerged with hollow eyes, their youth stripped away by weeks of ceaseless combat. Yet bonds of brotherhood grew unbreakable, forged in foxholes and ambushes where survival depended on trust. The human cost was staggering, but it created a generation hardened by fire, and in their endurance lay the strength that carried the campaign forward. By February 1943, the grinding offensives had achieved their purpose, forcing Japanese survivors from ridgelines and strongholds into retreat. Mount Austin and the Gifu had fallen, their defenders annihilated in last stands that left the ground littered with bodies. The Galloping Horse and Seahorse ridges, once formidable obstacles, were now in American hands after bloody assaults. Japanese positions collapsed into pockets, each one reduced by artillery, flamethrowers, and bayonet charges until resistance ceased. The banzai attacks, once terrifying, became acts of futility, brave but powerless against overwhelming firepower. For the Americans, victory came not in sweeping maneuvers, but in the steady grind of attrition, where persistence triumphed over fanaticism. The cost was immense, but the island was finally being cleared ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker. Guadalcanal, once a desperate foothold, was now an Allied stronghold, and the jungle, which had seemed invincible, had finally yielded under sheer endurance. The campaign's end was near, written in sweat, blood, and the unyielding will of men who refused to break. By January 1943, the Japanese High Command faced a grim reality. Guadalcanal could no longer be held. Months of attrition had bled their army white, leaving tens of thousands dead, and the survivors starving, diseased, and exhausted beyond redemption. Supply convoys had been shattered by Allied air and naval superiority, leaving only fragments of rations and ammunition trickling through. Once proud regiments had been reduced to skeleton units, gaunt men with hollow eyes clutching rifles they could barely lift. Tokyo weighed the prestige of holding Guadalcanal against the practical reality that its garrison was already collapsing. After heated debates, the Imperial General Headquarters decided that saving lives and preserving forces for future campaigns outweighed the symbolism of clinging to the island. The decision was framed not as retreat, but as a redeployment, a tactical maneuver cloaked in language of honor. Operation KE, as it was named, would extract the shattered remnants of Japan's Guadalcanal army. It would be carried out swiftly, silently, and under the noses of an Allied force, convinced the Japanese were preparing another desperate offensive, and thus a campaign of annihilation gave way to one of evacuation. The Japanese plan for Operation KE was audacious, relying on deception and timing to succeed. Rather than signaling weakness, Tokyo deliberately built up the illusion of new reinforcements, reinforcing Allied expectations of another assault. Radio traffic increased, dummy preparations were staged, and Japanese propaganda boasted of fresh divisions arriving to crush the Americans. In reality, the task force assembled for KE consisted of destroyers tasked not with landing men, but with carrying them away. Swift, heavily armed, and skilled in night maneuvers, these destroyers would make high-speed runs down the slot, embark evacuees, and vanish before daylight exposed them to Allied aircraft. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself oversaw the planning, recognizing that pride had to give way to pragmatism. For once, the Japanese would fight not to destroy the enemy, but to save their own soldiers from extinction. Every detail depended on speed, coordination, and secrecy, the very qualities that had made the Tokyo Express feared. But this time the mission's goal was not reinforcement, it was survival. And survival demanded humility in the face of defeat. On Guadalcanal itself, Japanese troops received the order to withdraw with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Many had expected to die on the island, sacrificed in futile banzai charges, or left to waste away from disease. Now, instead of orders to attack, they were told to prepare for evacuation, a chance to live to fight another day. Yet the process was fraught with agony, for only those still strong enough to march to the beaches could be saved. Thousands of sick and wounded were left behind, their comrades forced to abandon them with whispered apologies and final gestures of respect. Those who could walk staggered through jungle trails, gaunt figures guided by officers who themselves were weak with hunger. Ammunition was expended sparingly, used only to repel patrols or silence inquisitive Allied scouts. Soldiers moved under cover of darkness, slipping silently toward rendezvous points along the island's northwest coast. The journey was as much a funeral procession as a withdrawal, a ghost army fading into the jungle shadows, and the dignity of their retreat was matched only by its tragedy. The evacuation itself unfolded with precision that stunned even Allied intelligence. On the nights of February 1st, 4 and 7, Japanese destroyers swept into designated beaches under the cover of darkness. Soldiers scrambled aboard with desperate urgency, some collapsing on decks from exhaustion the moment they reached safety. Navy crews worked with ruthless efficiency, hauling men up by rope ladders, distributing rice balls, and tending to the half-dead who filled their holds. Each run carried away thousands packed into compartments so tight that men fainted from lack of air. Allied patrols detected unusual activity, but interpreted it as preparations for another offensive, failing to grasp the scale of the evacuation until it was nearly complete. By the time they realized what was happening, more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers had been whisked away under their noses. It was a rare Japanese tactical success, executed flawlessly despite overwhelming Allied superiority in sea and sky. Yet it was also a strategic defeat, for it admitted the loss of Guadalcanal after months of sacrifice, and no amount of precision could disguise the bitter truth of abandonment. For the Allies, the discovery that the Japanese had slipped away largely unscathed was a moment of shock. Intelligence officers had predicted one last climactic battle, a desperate banzai that would consume the remnants of Japan's garrison. Instead, patrols advancing into abandoned positions found nothing but graves, discarded equipment, and starving stragglers. Some wounded had been left behind too weak to be carried, their suffering a haunting testament to the cost of withdrawal. Marines and soldiers encountered emaciated prisoners who surrendered without a fight, their bodies ravaged by disease and hunger. The jungle, once alive with enemy fire, fell eerily silent as Allied patrols pushed forward without resistance. What had seemed like the prologue to another bloodbath ended instead in anticlimax, a vanishing act that robbed them of the chance to deliver final destruction. Yet the result was no less significant. Guadalcanal was firmly and irreversibly in Allied hands. The campaign that had begun in uncertainty and desperation had ended in triumph, and the cost of that triumph was written across every ridge, river, and grave. For Japanese commanders, Operation KE was celebrated as a tactical masterpiece, a rare victory snatched from the jaws of inevitable defeat. Admiral Yamamoto lauded the destroyer captains whose daring and skill had saved thousands of soldiers. Japanese newspapers spun the evacuation as a planned redeployment, disguising its true nature from a public unprepared for retreat. Yet among officers and soldiers alike, the truth was undeniable. Guadalcanal had been lost, and with it the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The Imperial Army, once feared as unstoppable, had suffered its first major defeat on land, a psychological blow as devastating as the physical losses. The survivors carried scars of disease, starvation, and bitter memory, their strength spent in a futile campaign. Though they would fight again in New Georgia, Bougainville, and countless other islands, they would never fully regain the momentum lost at Guadalcanal. The campaign had consumed Japan's resources and exposed the limits of its empire. Operation KE had saved men but surrendered the island, and with that surrender the tide of war began its irreversible turn. For American forces, victory on Guadalcanal marked the end of a crucible that had tested every dimension of war. Marines who had landed in August with meager supplies and little hope now looked across cleared ridges with the satisfaction of hard-won success. Soldiers of the Americal and 25th Divisions could claim their share of the triumph, having borne the burden of the final offensives. Sailors who had fought desperate night battles in Ironbottom Sound now watched convoys arrive unmolested, secure in seas they had bled to control. Pilots of the Cactus Air Force, once outnumbered and underfed, now dominated skies that had seemed hostile only months before. Victory was not the product of a single battle, but of endurance, adaptation, and relentless pressure. The campaign had demanded everything: leadership, logistics, courage, and sacrifice. And in that demand, it had forged a generation of fighters who now knew the enemy could be beaten. Guadalcanal was no longer just an island. It was a symbol of resilience, and in its jungles, the future of the Pacific had begun to unfold. The end of Guadalcanal resonated far beyond its tangled ridges and blood-stained beaches. For Tokyo, it marked the first acknowledgement that its expansion could be stopped and reversed, a crack in the myth of invincibility. For Washington, it was the first major step on the long road across the Pacific, proof that amphibious warfare could succeed against a determined foe. For the men who fought there, it was a memory seared into body and soul, a campaign that consumed 6 months yet seemed to last a lifetime. Graves dotted the landscape, silent markers of sacrifice that bore witness to the cost of victory. The island, once obscure, had become a name spoken with reverence and dread in equal measure. Operation K ended the battle, but not the war, for the struggle would spread across the Solomons, the Bismarcks, and beyond. Yet Guadalcanal had shifted the balance irrevocably, placing Japan on the defensive for the first time. The battle that began as a desperate gamble ended as a turning point, and in its conclusion, the Pacific War entered a new and decisive chapter. When the guns finally fell silent over Guadalcanal in February 1943, the scale of sacrifice became brutally clear. The Japanese had committed over 30,000 soldiers to the campaign, yet fewer than half ever left the island alive. Disease, starvation, and relentless combat consumed the rest, leaving behind shallow graves and unmarked jungle mounds. Of those who survived, Thousands returned skeletal and broken, shadows of the divisions that had once landed with confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 2 battleships, a dozen cruisers, and over 24 destroyers in the desperate effort to hold the island. Their vaunted air wings had been shattered, with hundreds of veteran pilots gone, irreplaceable in a war where skill meant survival. American losses were also staggering, nearly 7,000 dead, over 24 warships sunk, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Thousands more suffered wounds, disease, and exhaustion that scarred them for life. Ironbottom Sound was littered with wrecks, each one a steel tomb testifying to the cost of 6 months of unrelenting struggle, and Guadalcanal stood as proof that victory in the Pacific would never come cheaply. For the Japanese, the material losses carried implications far beyond the island itself. The destruction of their surface fleet in repeated night battles drained a reservoir of experienced officers and sailors who could not be replaced quickly. The loss of veteran carrier and bomber pilots, first at Midway and then attrition at Guadalcanal, created a void that left Japan's skies increasingly vulnerable. The Tokyo Express had burned through irreplaceable fuel, a resource Japan could never replenish at the pace of American production. The humiliation of retreat, disguised as redeployment, shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Imperial Army since 1937. Tokyo's strategy of expanding by seizing island bases had met its first immovable wall. Morale at home, though shielded by propaganda, trembled beneath the weight of families who received only silence instead of letters from the front. Even victories such as Tassafaronga felt hollow, as strategic goals slipped further away with each passing week. Guadalcanal was not merely a defeat, it was the fracture of a grand design, and in that fracture lay the seeds of Japan's inevitable decline. For the Allies, Guadalcanal was both triumph and warning. Triumph, because it marked the first major ground victory against Japan, the moment when the tide of expansion had finally been halted. Warning, because the price of that victory revealed the sheer difficulty of the road ahead. American industry could build ships and aircraft, but men could not be forged in factories, and Guadalcanal had drained thousands in their prime. The U.S. Navy had lost more cruisers than at Pearl Harbor, each one sending hundreds of sailors into Ironbottom Sound. The Marines of the 1st Division emerged victorious but battered, their ranks riddled with malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. Army units fresh to the campaign found themselves blooded in battles that chewed through their strength within weeks. Pilots who had held Henderson Field spoke of exhaustion so deep that each sortie felt like a final gamble. Guadalcanal taught the Allies that endurance, logistics, and adaptation would be as vital as courage. Victory had been secured, but only by the narrowest of margins, and the lesson lingered like a scar across every surviving veteran. The human cost of Guadalcanal could not be measured only in numbers. Marines remembered comrades buried in hastily dug graves, marked with rifles driven into the soil, helmets balanced on their stocks. Soldiers carried the images of skeletal Japanese prisoners, enemies who had fought ferociously before collapsing into surrender. Sailors recalled the eerie silence after ships sank, leaving only oil fires and the cries of men adrift in the dark. Airmen thought of friends who never returned, their planes swallowed by jungle or sea. Survivors spoke of nights haunted by whispers in the jungle, the sudden crack of gunfire, or the endless drone of mosquitoes. Corpsmen and medics remembered the stench of tropical wounds, the fevers of malaria, and the desperate improvisations of medicine in foxholes. For every man who survived, the campaign etched a memory that no victory parade could erase. Guadalcanal was not only a battlefield but a crucible of human endurance, and in that crucible, men were broken, hardened, and forever changed. Strategically, Guadalcanal shifted the balance of the Pacific War irreversibly. For the first time, Japan was forced onto the defensive, abandoning an objective it had once proclaimed essential to the security of its empire. The Allies, though battered, proved that amphibious warfare could succeed against entrenched and determined opposition. Henderson Field became the symbol of the new reality that control of the air could dictate the outcome of entire campaigns. From Guadalcanal, Allied forces launched strikes that menaced every Japanese base in the Solomons, forcing Tokyo into a reactive posture. The defeat undermined Japan's ability to threaten Australia, securing a vital link in the Allied chain of communication. Strategists in Washington and Canberra now envisioned an island-hopping offensive, using Guadalcanal as the first stepping stone. Tokyo, by contrast, shifted its goals from expansion to desperate attempts at holding lines it had once advanced with ease. The great momentum of 1941-42 had been blunted on one small island, and from that moment onward the initiative belonged to the Allies. The cost in ships alone underscored the ferocity of the struggle. The Allies lost 2 carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, and over a dozen destroyers, with dozens more heavily damaged. The Japanese losses were even greater: 2 battleships, a carrier, a dozen cruisers, and over 20 destroyers sacrificed in desperate efforts to hold the island. Both navies bled heavily in Ironbottom Sound, but Japan lacked the shipyards and fuel to replace its losses. America's vast industrial capacity, already accelerating, promised that every wreck would be matched by 2 new hulls within a year. Pilots, however, could not be manufactured so easily, and here the strategic difference was stark. Japan's most experienced aviators lay dead in jungle graves or beneath the sea, while the US was building vast training programs to churn out replacements. Materially and industrially, Guadalcanal was a war of attrition. Japan could not win. Every ship sunk and every plane destroyed widened the gulf between Tokyo and Washington, and by the end of the campaign, that gulf had become unbridgeable. The campaign also reshaped command thinking on both sides. For the Americans, the necessity of joint operations between Navy, Marines, and Army was no longer a theory but a lived experience. Coordination, logistics, and inter-service cooperation became the foundation of future island campaigns. Radar proved itself as a weapon as vital as any gun, guiding ships through nights of chaos and saving lives that would once have been lost to confusion. Japanese command, by contrast, learned that courage and skill could not compensate for starvation, inadequate logistics, and enemy industrial might. Their belief in the decisive battle, a single clash that would annihilate American power, was undermined by the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal. The lessons of the island would echo in battles across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Leyte. But on Guadalcanal, those lessons were written in the blood of thousands, and they could not be ignored. In the end, Guadalcanal's aftermath was both victory and warning, triumph and tragedy. For the Allies, it was proof that the Japanese could be beaten, that jungle, sea, and sky could be mastered by endurance and adaptation. For Japan, it was a shattering recognition that its empire was stretched too thin, its resources too fragile, and its men too mortal to fight forever. The casualty lists and wrecked fleets testified to the price of victory, a price so steep that no one left the island unscarred. Families across America, Australia, and Japan received telegrams of loss, each one a reminder that glory was purchased in grief. The jungles of Guadalcanal remained haunted, the graves of the fallen standing as silent witnesses to the cost of war. Yet in that cost lay the seed of momentum, the first push back against an enemy once thought unstoppable. Guadalcanal was not the end of the Pacific War, but it was the end of the beginning, and its aftermath proved that the road ahead would be as costly as it was necessary. Guadalcanal's legacy was not confined to its jungles or the wrecks that lay beneath Ironbottom Sound. It lived on in the doctrines and institutions that shaped the remainder of the Pacific War. For the United States, the campaign demonstrated with brutal clarity that joint warfare was not optional but essential. Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen had fought side by side, often improvising their coordination under fire, but the lessons they forged in blood became the blueprint for future operations. The Navy learned that carriers, battleships, and destroyers could not operate in isolation, but must function as part of a larger ecosystem tied to land-based airfields. The Army discovered that logistics was as decisive as rifles, and that control of supply determined whether divisions advanced or starved. The Marine Corps internalized the value of flexibility, adapting amphibious doctrine to realities harsher than any exercise could have prepared them for. Pilots and mechanics proved that airfields hacked from coral and jungle could anchor entire campaigns if supplied and defended with tenacity. Each service had bled, but each had also grown, their failures transformed into lessons no classroom could teach. And those lessons echoed across every island that followed. At sea, the doctrinal changes were profound and permanent. Radar, once mistrusted, became the indispensable eye of the fleet, guiding ships through darkness and giving commanders confidence to contest Japan's mastery of night combat. Destroyers, once relegated to escort duties, emerged as the sharp edge of naval battle, launching torpedoes and screening convoys with newfound aggression. Carriers already proven at Coral Sea and Midway now cemented their status as the centerpiece of naval power, with Henderson Field serving as a land-based extension of their reach. Navy recognized that concentration of force was no longer a matter of ships in line, but of integration between sea, air, and land. Japanese reliance on the long-lance torpedo and night gunnery could not overcome America's technological adaptation and industrial replacement capacity. Doctrine shifted toward coordination, speed, and aggressive use of radar, a revolution that would culminate in decisive victories at places like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Ironbottom Sound became more than a graveyard. It was a classroom carved in steel and fire, and its lessons guided the fleet for the rest of the war. On land, Guadalcanal became the crucible that forged Allied jungle warfare doctrine. Soldiers learned to respect the environment as an enemy as lethal as the Japanese, shaping tactics around disease prevention, supply distribution, and terrain mastery. Patrols adapted to move with scouts, flankers, and overlapping fields of fire, trading rigid formations for fluid movements tailored to thick canopy and hidden ravines. Combined arms evolved out of necessity, with infantry working in concert with artillery, tanks, and close air support to clear ridges and bunkers that defied frontal assaults. The psychological strain of night fighting and banzai charges forced new emphasis on discipline, foxhole readiness, and integrated communication. Medical services developed new protocols for malaria prevention, casualty evacuation, and tropical treatment, lessons that saved thousands in later campaigns. Engineers learned how to build and maintain airstrips, roads, and supply depots under constant enemy fire and torrential weather. Every advance revealed the importance of preparation and adaptability, as terrain dictated tactics in ways unfamiliar to European battlefields. By war's end, the doctrines born on Guadalcanal were embedded into every operation across the Central and Southwest Pacific, and the men who had survived the island carried those lessons with them wherever they fought next. The human legacy of Guadalcanal was etched not only in doctrine but in memory, in the stories veterans carried back to their homes. Marines spoke of the first desperate weeks, when hunger and fear made every day feel like the last. Soldiers remembered the grinding assaults up Mount Austin and the Gifu, where comrades fell one by one in battles measured in yards. Sailors carried memories of burning ships and oil-slicked seas, of rescuing shipmates from infernos that lit the night sky. Pilots told of Henderson's patched runways, where every sortie felt like a gamble and every return a victory. Coleman recalled the endless tide of malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds, their work as constant as the rain. Each story, individual and intimate, became part of a collective memory that shaped how nations understood sacrifice. For Americans, Guadalcanal became synonymous with grit and determination against impossible odds. For Japanese survivors, it was a wound of pride and loss, remembered as both heroic endurance and devastating betrayal by logistics. And in both nations, the island left a mark far deeper than maps could ever show. For Japan, Guadalcanal's legacy was one of sobering recognition. The campaign revealed the limits of imperial expansion, demonstrating that courage and tactical brilliance could not substitute for industrial strength and sustainable logistics. The myth of invincibility, cultivated since the fall of Singapore and the early months of 1942, cracked under the weight of defeat. Japanese soldiers who returned from the island bore witness to starvation, exhaustion, and the futility of sacrifice without supply. Naval officers confronted the painful truth that even their most advanced torpedoes and night tactics could not outlast American adaptation. Strategists shifted from offensive dreams to defensive desperation, preparing for campaigns designed to delay rather than to conquer. Guadalcanal marked the moment when Tokyo's grand design began to unravel, each subsequent operation shaped by the shadow of resources lost and veterans gone. Propaganda spun the evacuation as a tactical redeployment, but the soldiers and sailors knew the truth. Guadalcanal was a defeat that could not be disguised, and it signaled the long, slow retreat that would define the remainder of Japan's war. For the Allies, the island became a cornerstone of Pacific strategy, a template for the long and grinding march toward Tokyo. The success of joint operations convinced planners that amphibious assaults, though costly, could succeed with proper coordination of sea, air, and land power. Logistics became the centerpiece of every future plan, with supply chains prioritized as carefully as battle orders. Guadalcanal showed that seizing and holding airfields could tilt entire campaigns, anchoring fleets and isolating enemy strongholds. The psychological victory was just as powerful, for it proved that the Japanese could be beaten, not just checked, and that Allied endurance could outlast fanatical resistance. Leaders like Vandegrift, Halsey, and Patch carried the experience forward, shaping decisions that guided the Central and Southwest Pacific drives. Every subsequent battle, from Tarawa to Prelude to Okinawa, carried echoes of the lessons first learned on Guadalcanal, and every victory thereafter traced part of its lineage back to one obscure island in the Solomons. The memory of Guadalcanal lived on after the war, memorialized in cemeteries, books, films, and the recollections of those who fought there. The name itself became shorthand for hardship and sacrifice, invoked by veterans with both pride and sorrow. Monuments rose in America, Australia, and the Solomon Islands, marking ground once soaked with blood. Pilgrimages returned veterans to ridges and beaches, where silence and jungle growth covered the scars of combat. The wrecks of Ironbottom Sound became both war graves and historical markers, their rusting hulks telling silent stories to divers decades later. Historians dissected the campaign as the Pacific turning point, the moment momentum shifted irreversibly to the Allies. Nations remembered not only the strategic lessons but the human cost, the ordinary men who bore extraordinary burdens. Guadalcanal was not forgotten, for its legacy touched every family that lost a son, brother, or father there. And in its remembrance it became more than a battle. it became a symbol of resilience. In the final measure, Guadalcanal was both crucible and compass, shaping the course of the Pacific War and the memory of those who fought it. It revealed that victory demanded more than courage. It required coordination, endurance, and the will to adapt in the face of hardship. It proved that even the most determined enemy could be beaten when supply, strategy, and spirit aligned. It left a generation scarred but also strengthened, their sacrifices laying the foundation for the island-hopping campaigns to come. It marked the moment when Japan's expansion ended and America's counteroffensive began, a pivot point in the greatest conflict of the century. The island's ridges, rivers, and runways became synonymous with lessons paid for in blood. Its wreck-strewn waters whispered of the cost of learning those lessons, and its jungles, still and quiet now, carried the echoes of a struggle that decided the fate of the Pacific. Guadalcanal was not the end of the war, but it was the end of Japan's ascendancy, and in its legacy, the future course of history was set.